Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Jake Morrison had been patrolling the back roads of Millbrook County, Texas for 8 years, but he'd never received a call quite like the one that came through his radio at 2:47 a.m. on that humid September night in 2018. The dispatcher's voice carried an unusual edge of confusion as she relayed the information, and Jake could hear papers rustling in the background like she was double-checking her notes. Unit 23, we've got a missing person report at 1247 Crane Road. Caller states her husband left for work this morning and never came home. Says his truck is parked at Miller's Junction, but he's nowhere to be found. Jake acknowledged the call and began the 20-minute drive toward the remote intersection known locally as Miller's Junction. It was one of those places that existed on county maps but had no real purpose. Just a crossroads where two farm-to-market roads met in the middle of endless cotton fields and the occasional oil derrick. The kind of place where cell service was spotty and the nearest neighbor was miles away. As his patrol car cut through the darkness, headlights sweeping across empty fields and weathered fence posts, Jake found himself thinking about how routine missing person calls usually were in rural Texas. Most of the time, the missing person was at a bar in the next county, visiting a friend they'd forgotten to mention to their family, or dealing with some personal crisis they hadn't shared. By morning, they'd usually turn up with a sheepish apology and a reasonable explanation that made everyone feel foolish for worrying. But something about this call nagged at Jake. Miller's Junction wasn't the kind of place people just stopped at randomly. There was nothing there except four-way stop signs and empty horizon in every direction. No gas stations, no convenience stores, no reason for anyone to be there unless they were passing through on their way somewhere else. And according to the caller, her husband's normal route to work wouldn't take him anywhere near Miller's Junction. Jake had worked this area long enough to know every ranch road and farm gate within a 50-mile radius. He knew which families had been feuding for generations over water rights, which teenagers were most likely to be caught drinking beer behind the old grain elevator, and which back roads would wash out in heavy rain. Miller's Junction had never been the site of anything more interesting than the occasional fender bender when someone ran the stop sign in foggy conditions. The intersection came into view as Jake crested a small rise, his headlights illuminating the stop signs and the dark ribbon of asphalt stretching away in 4 directions. Sure enough, there was a white pickup truck sitting on the gravel shoulder near the northeast corner, positioned normally as if the driver had simply pulled over to check something and planned to get back on the road momentarily. Jake pulled up behind the vehicle and ran the license plate through dispatch before getting out of his patrol car. The truck came back registered to Marcus Henley, age 34, with an address that matched the location where the missing person report had originated. Clean driving record, no outstanding warrants, no red flags in the system that would suggest this was anything other than what it appeared to be, a man who'd stopped his truck and then vanished. Protocol dictated that Jake approach any abandoned vehicle with caution, so he kept his flashlight ready and his other hand near his service weapon as he walked toward the pickup. The driver's side door was unlocked, and when he opened it, the dome light revealed an interior that was neat and organized. Marcus Henley's wallet was on the passenger seat, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and $43 in cash. His cell phone was in the center console, but the battery was dead. What struck Jake as particularly odd was how deliberately arranged everything seemed. A thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, still warm to the touch despite the cool night air. A half-eaten sandwich was wrapped in aluminum foil on the dashboard, preserved as if Marcus had intended to return and finish his meal. The keys were still in the ignition, and when Jake turned them, the engine started immediately. No mechanical problems that would have forced the driver to abandon his vehicle. Jake stepped back from the truck and began a careful examination of the surrounding area with his flashlight. The ground around the vehicle showed clear boot prints in the dust, size 10 or 11 work boots, the kind worn by men who did physical labor for a living. The prints led away from the truck toward the center of the intersection, following a straight line as if Marcus had walked with purpose toward some specific destination. But 15 feet from the truck, the footprints simply stopped existing. Jake had worked enough crime scenes to know that tracks don't just disappear without explanation. Wind could blur them over time, rain could wash them away, other traffic could obscure them. But on this still clear night, with no recent rain and no other tire tracks or footprints in the area, the abrupt termination of Marcus Henley's boot prints made no logical sense. Jake expanded his search pattern, walking in widening circles around the truck and the spot where the tracks ended. The county roads were paved, so footprints wouldn't show there, but the shoulders were all dirt and gravel that should have held impressions clearly. If Marcus had walked in any direction from where his footprints terminated, there should have been some trace of his passage. 20 minutes of careful searching with his flashlight revealed nothing. No additional footprints leading away from the intersection, no tire tracks from another vehicle that might have picked him up, no signs of a struggle or violence, no blood or disturbed vegetation. It was as if Marcus Henley had walked 15 feet from his truck and then simply ceased to exist. Jake radioed for backup and requested that a supervisor respond to the scene. While waiting, he called the number from the missing person report. Sarah Henley answered on the second ring, her voice tight with worry that had clearly kept her awake. "Did you find him?" she asked immediately, before Jake could even identify himself. "Ma'am, this is Officer Morrison with the Millbrook County Police. I've located your husband's truck at Miller's Junction, but Mr. Henley isn't here. I need to ask you some questions to help with our investigation." There was a pause, then the sound of Sarah Henley taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Okay, what do you need to know?" "First, is it normal for your husband to stop at Miller's Junction? Would he have any reason to be at that location?" "Miller's Junction? No, never. I don't even think I know where that is. Marcus works at the Chevron plant in Beaumont. He takes Highway 6 straight there and back every day, same route for 3 years. There's no reason he'd ever stop at some intersection I've never heard of." Jake made careful notes in his patrol book. "When did you last speak with your husband, ma'am?" "This morning when he left for work around 6:30. He seemed normal, maybe a little tired because he'd been working overtime this week, but normal. He kissed me goodbye, said he'd be home by 7 for dinner. When he didn't show up by 8, I started worrying. When he didn't answer his phone by 9, I knew something was wrong." "Did he mention stopping anywhere on the way home? Meeting someone, running an errand, anything like that?" "No, nothing like that. Marcus is very predictable with his routine. Work, home, that's it. He's not the type to just wander off or make unplanned stops. If he was going to be late, he would have called." "Has he been under any unusual stress lately? Work problems, financial issues, anything that might cause him to want to take some time away?" Sarah Henley's voice became defensive. "Officer, my husband didn't run away, if that's what you're suggesting. We've been married 12 years, and Marcus has never missed dinner without calling. Something bad has happened to him. I can feel it." Jake assured her that they were taking the situation seriously and would conduct a thorough investigation. He took down additional details about Marcus's appearance, what he'd been wearing, his normal work schedule, and any other information that might be relevant to finding him. By the time backup arrived, Jake had documented everything he could observe at the scene, but he was no closer to understanding what had happened to Marcus Henley. Deputy Ashley Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran of the county sheriff's department, walked the scene with Jake, and her reaction to the footprint evidence mirrored his own confusion. "That makes no damn sense," she said, crouching beside the spot where the tracks ended and playing her flashlight beam across the undisturbed ground beyond. "Even if someone picked him up here, we should see tire tracks, scuff marks, some kind of evidence of another vehicle. This ground is perfect for showing impressions. That's what's bothering me, Jake replied. Everything about this scene suggests Marcus got out of his truck voluntarily, walked toward the intersection with some specific purpose in mind, and then just vanished into thin air. They spent another hour at the scene, taking photographs with their cameras, measuring the footprints with a ruler from Jake's patrol kit, and searching an expanded perimeter that covered nearly a quarter-mile radius around the intersection. As the night wore on, the strangeness of the situation only became more pronounced. Miller's Junction was essentially a void in the landscape, a place where two empty highways crossed with nothing but agricultural land extending to the horizon in every direction. There were no buildings, no businesses, no structures of any kind except for the stop signs and a few weathered fence posts. There was no reason for anyone to be there unless they were traveling from one place to another. And Marcus Henley hadn't been traveling to Miller's Junction. His route to and from work was clearly established through his wife's testimony and his employment records, and Miller's Junction was 15 miles out of his way in a direction that made no sense. Around 4:30 a.m., as Jake and Ashley were preparing to have the truck towed to the police impound lot for more detailed forensic examination, Jake's radio crackled with an update from dispatch that made both officers stop what they were doing and stare at each other. Unit 23, we've got another missing person report. Male subject, age 41, last seen yesterday evening. Vehicle found abandoned at Miller's Junction. Jake and Ashley exchanged glances of disbelief. Dispatch, did you say Miller's Junction? Jake asked into his radio. Affirmative, Unit 23. Caller reports her husband's blue Toyota Camry is at the intersection of County Roads 47 and 19. Husband's name is Blake Patterson, age 41, employed at Morrison Feed and Seed. Never came home from work yesterday. Jake felt a chill run down his spine despite the humid night air. Dispatch, we're still at that location conducting a missing person investigation. There's no blue Toyota here. A pause, then, Unit 23. Caller is en route to the scene. She says she can see the car from County Road 47 as she approaches the intersection. Jake and Ashley immediately drove the quarter mile to where County Road 47 approached Miller's Junction from the south. Sure enough, a blue Toyota Camry sat on the shoulder, positioned almost exactly where Marcus Henley's white truck had been found, except on the opposite side of the intersection. The similarities between the two scenes were impossible to ignore, and deeply unsettling. Keys in the ignition, wallet on the passenger seat, cell phone in the car with a dead battery. Blake Patterson's work boots had left clear prints in the dust leading away from the vehicle toward the center of the intersection, then vanishing at precisely the same spot where Marcus Henley's tracks had ended. Two men, different ages, different vehicles, different employers, different routes home from work. Both had somehow been drawn to the same desolate intersection. Both had abandoned their vehicles in similar fashion. Both had walked toward the same spot in the center of Miller's Junction, and both had simply disappeared. This isn't a coincidence, Ashley said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of unease that comes when veteran law enforcement officers encounter something that doesn't fit any pattern they've seen before. Jake nodded, already reaching for his radio to request additional units and supervisory response. Whatever's happening here, it's not random. Someone or something is drawing people to this location. As the sun began to rise over the cotton fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous given the circumstances, Jake realized he was no longer dealing with routine missing persons cases. The two abandoned vehicles, positioned like points on some invisible geometric pattern around Miller's Junction, represented something far more disturbing than coincidence. But before Jake could finish processing the implications of what they'd discovered, his radio crackled again with a transmission that made his blood run cold. All units in the Miller's Junction area were receiving reports of a third abandoned vehicle. Gray pickup truck, Texas plates, registered to Tyler Jenkins, age 29. Vehicle located on County Road 19, approximately 200 yards from the intersection. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he and Ashley drove toward the third vehicle. 3 trucks now, positioned around Miller's Junction like points on a triangle. 3 missing men who'd had no reason to be at this remote intersection. 3 sets of footprints leading to the same impossible vanishing point. The gray pickup truck sat exactly where dispatch had indicated, and Jake's examination revealed the same disturbing pattern. Keys in ignition, personal belongings left behind, footprints leading toward the center of the intersection before disappearing at the same spot where the previous 2 men's tracks had terminated. Tyler Jenkins was a roughneck who worked rotating shifts on oil rigs scattered across East Texas. According to his roommate, who'd called in the missing person report, Tyler should have been driving north toward his next job assignment. Instead, his truck was parked at Miller's Junction, 15 miles south of his intended route. By 8 a.m., Jake was staring at 3 abandoned vehicles positioned around the intersection like markers on some cosmic map, each representing a man who'd vanished without explanation after walking toward the same point in the center of Miller's Junction. The forensic team that had been called out from the county seat was baffled by the evidence, and Jake's supervisor, Sergeant Brandon Walsh, had arrived to coordinate what was rapidly becoming a major investigation. "Jake, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like this," Sergeant Walsh said as they stood at the center of the intersection where all 3 sets of footprints terminated. 3 men, no connection to each other that we can identify, all drawn to this same spot, all vanishing without a trace. Jake studied the crime scene photographs that had been taken throughout the morning, trying to find some pattern or clue that would explain what had happened. "Sergeant, I keep coming back to the timing. Marcus Henley disappeared Tuesday night, Blake Patterson Wednesday night, Tyler Jenkins Thursday night. The pattern is escalating, 1 disappearance per night, all at the same location." "Which suggests," Walsh replied grimly, "that whatever's causing this might not be finished. If the pattern continues, we could have another disappearance tonight." The thought of another family receiving the kind of devastating phone call that Sarah Henley, Blake Patterson's ex-wife and Tyler Jenkins's roommate, had made was unbearable to Jake. But more than that, the methodical nature of the disappearances suggested something far more sinister than random misfortune. As Jake prepared detailed reports on each of the 3 cases, he couldn't shake the feeling that Miller's Junction was hiding secrets that went deeper than 3 missing men. The perfect positioning of the vehicles, the identical termination point of all the footprints, the complete absence of any evidence beyond that point, it all suggested a level of planning and organization that made his skin crawl. Sarah Henley arrived at the scene around noon, having driven out to see where her husband's truck had been found. She was a small woman in her early 30s with long brown hair and eyes red from crying and sleepless worry. When she saw her husband's truck surrounded by police tape and 2 other abandoned vehicles, she broke down completely. "Where is he?" she sobbed, gripping Jake's arm with desperate strength. "Where's Marcus? This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. Why would he be here? What is this place?" Jake wished he had answers for her. He wished he had answers for himself. But as he stared at the 3 vehicles positioned around Miller's Junction like points on a triangle, all he had were questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The worst part was the growing certainty that this was just the beginning. Something about Miller's Junction was drawing these men here, and whatever was happening to them was happening with increasing frequency. Marcus Henley had been missing for 36 hours, Blake Patterson for 24 hours, Tyler Jenkins for 12 hours. The pattern was accelerating, and Jake had the sinking feeling that time was running out to prevent the next disappearance. By noon on Friday, Miller's Junction had been transformed into what looked like a major crime scene from a television show. Yellow police tape fluttered in the hot Texas wind, marking off a perimeter that extended nearly a quarter mile in each direction from the intersection. Jake Morrison found himself serving as the primary investigating officer on what had become the most significant case in Millbrook County's recent history, coordinating with forensic specialists, K-9 units, and a Texas Ranger who'd been dispatched from Austin to provide assistance. The 3 abandoned vehicles sat exactly where they'd been found, each now surrounded by its own smaller perimeter of crime scene tape and evidence markers. Forensic photographer Michelle Sanders had spent the morning documenting every detail of the scene, taking hundreds of photos from every conceivable angle. The crime scene technicians had made plaster casts of all the footprints, measured distances with surveyor precision, and collected soil samples from the area where the tracks terminated. But despite all the professional attention and sophisticated equipment, they were no closer to understanding what had happened to Marcus Henley, Blake Patterson, and Tyler Jenkins than they'd been at dawn. Officer Morrison called Dr. Patricia Wells, the forensic anthropologist who'd driven down from Dallas to examine the footprint evidence. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing khaki field clothes and carrying a clipboard thick with notes and diagrams. Jake walked over to where she was crouched beside the spot where all 3 sets of tracks ended, about 15 feet from the center of the intersection. She'd been studying the footprints with various instruments for over 2 hours, and her expression was deeply troubled. "Dr. Wells, what can you tell me?" She stood up, brushing dust from her knees, and consulted her notes. "Officer Morrison, I've been analyzing footprint evidence for 22 years. I've worked cases in every conceivable type of terrain and weather condition. What we have here defies basic physics." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "The depth and clarity of these tracks indicate that all 3 men were walking normally, not running or being dragged. The gait pattern is consistent with voluntary, purposeful movement. The spacing suggests they were walking at a normal pace, not hurried or distressed. But then the tracks just stop." She gestured to the ground with her pen. "Look at the last clear footprint from each man. The toe impression is slightly deeper than the heel, indicating forward momentum. These men were in mid-stride when whatever happened to them happened. Could someone have swept the area clean somehow? Erased the tracks after this point?" Dr. Wells shook her head emphatically. "I've examined the soil composition and surface characteristics in minute detail. If someone had swept or raked this area, we'd see disturbance marks, disrupted soil consistency, some kind of evidence of the erasure. This looks like the tracks were never made beyond this point." "But that's impossible." "I know it's impossible, Officer Morrison. That's why I've been out here for 2 hours trying to find an explanation that makes sense, but the evidence is what it is." Jake stared at the innocuous patch of ground where 3 men had seemingly vanished into thin air. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the heat was already becoming oppressive. But he felt cold as he contemplated the implications of what Dr. Wells was telling him. Texas Ranger Kyle Roberts approached from where he'd been interviewing the families of the missing men. Roberts was a tall, lean man in his 40s with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of working outdoor crime scenes. He'd arrived from Austin 3 hours earlier and had taken charge of coordinating the multi-agency response. "Jake, I've finished the family interviews. No connections between the 3 men that we can identify. Different social circles, different workplaces, different ages and backgrounds. Marcus Henley worked at a chemical plant. Blake Patterson owned a small feed store. Tyler Jenkins was a roughneck on rotating oil rig assignments." Jake reviewed his own notes from the initial investigations. "Different routes to and from work, too. None of their normal travel patterns would have brought them past Miller's Junction." "Which raises the question of what drew them here," Roberts said. "I've had officers checking with local businesses, gas stations, anywhere these men might have stopped or been seen in the days before they disappeared. So far, nothing." The forensic team had expanded their search to a half-mile radius around the intersection, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to look for any evidence of disturbance beneath the surface. They'd found the usual rural debris, old cans, pieces of wire, fragments of farm equipment that had been buried by years of wind and rain, but nothing that seemed connected to the disappearances. What was beginning to worry Jake, more than the lack of physical evidence, was the media attention the case was starting to attract. Word had leaked about the mysterious vanishings at Miller's Junction, and by mid-afternoon, news vans from 3 television stations had arrived, along with reporters from newspapers in Houston and Dallas. The last thing they needed was a circus atmosphere interfering with the investigation. "Ranger Roberts," Jake said, as they watched reporters setting up cameras and interviewing anyone willing to talk about the missing men. "I'm concerned about all this publicity. If this case turns into a media spectacle, we might get copycat incidents or people coming out here looking for souvenirs." Roberts nodded grimly. "Already thought of that. I'm having the county road department set up barriers on all 4 approaches to the intersection. No unauthorized personnel past the outer perimeter." As if summoned by their conversation about media attention, Jake's radio crackled with a call from dispatch that made both men stop what they were doing and pay attention. "Unit 23, we've got a reporter at the sheriff's department asking to speak with the investigating officers. Says she has information about similar cases that might be relevant to your investigation." Jake and Roberts exchanged glances. "What kind of information?" Jake asked into his radio. "Reporter says she's been researching missing person cases in East Texas for a book she's writing. Claims there have been other disappearances in this area over the past few years that show similar patterns." Roberts grabbed Jake's radio. "Dispatch, this is Texas Ranger Roberts. Have that reporter wait in the interview room. We'll be there in 30 minutes. The drive back to the sheriff's department gave Jake time to think about the disturbing possibility that the Miller's Junction disappearances weren't an isolated incident. If someone had information about similar cases, it could mean they were dealing with a serial predator who'd been operating in the area for years without being detected. The reporter turned out to be Jessica Romano, a freelance journalist from Austin who specialized in cold cases and unsolved crimes. She was in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a business suit despite the Texas heat. She'd spread papers and files across the interview room table and looked up expectantly as Jake and Roberts entered. "Officers, thank you for meeting with me. I know you must be incredibly busy with this investigation." Roberts remained standing, arms crossed in a posture that made clear he wasn't entirely comfortable sharing information with the media. "Ms. Romano, we don't typically discuss ongoing investigations with reporters. What exactly do you think you can tell us that would be helpful?" "It's not what I can tell you," she replied, gesturing to the documents on the table. "It's what I can show you. For the past 18 months, I've been researching a pattern of missing person cases across rural East Texas. Cases where people simply vanished without explanation, often leaving behind vehicles with no signs of struggle or foul play." Jake moved closer to examine the documents, which appeared to be police reports, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes organized chronologically and by location. "In March of last year," Romano continued, "a man named Derek Walsh disappeared near Jasper. His truck was found on a back road, keys in the ignition, no signs of violence. In June, 2 separate incidents in Newton County. Both men, both vehicles found abandoned in remote locations. September, another case near Huntsville." She pulled out a large map of East Texas with red pins marking locations across several counties. 15 cases total over the past 3 years, all men between the ages of 25 and 45. All had their vehicles found abandoned in isolated rural areas. All vanished without a trace. Roberts leaned forward to study the map more carefully. Why weren't these cases connected before now? Different jurisdictions shouldn't prevent communication between law enforcement agencies. Different agencies, different investigators, and most were initially treated as voluntary missing persons, Romano explained. Men having midlife crises, running away from debts or family problems. But I started noticing patterns when I was researching rural crime statistics for my book. Jake counted the pins on the map, feeling increasingly uneasy as he realized the scope of what Romano was suggesting. "You said 15 cases, but I only count 14 pins here." Romano pointed to a blank space on the map near their location. The 15th pin goes here, Miller's Junction, because this isn't the first time people have disappeared from this exact location. She pulled out a folder marked with the county name and a date from 17 years earlier. Inside were copies of police reports and newspaper articles that Jake had never seen before, despite working in the area for 8 years. August 2001, Romano read from the file. 3 men disappeared from Miller's Junction over a 2-week period. Shane Garrett, age 32, oil field worker. Cody Mitchell, age 28, ranch hand. Austin Blake, age 35, truck driver. Their vehicles were found abandoned at the intersection just like this week. The cases were never solved. Jake felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him as he read the names from the old reports. The details were identical to their current cases. Vehicles found with keys in the ignition, personal belongings left behind, footprints leading toward the center of the intersection, and then vanishing. "How did we not know about these cases?" Roberts demanded, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a professional law enforcement officer who discovered that crucial information had been withheld from an investigation. "Different sheriff at the time, different department leadership," Romano explained. "The reports were filed away and forgotten when the investigation went cold. The only reason I found them was because I requested all missing person files from the county archives for my research. These reports weren't in the active files, they were in storage." Jake was studying the old crime scene photographs, which could have been taken yesterday for all the similarity they bore to their current investigation. The same intersection, the same positioning of abandoned vehicles around the crossroads, the same mysterious absence of the missing men. "Ms. Romano," Jake said slowly, trying to process the implications of what she'd shown them. "In your research into these 15 cases, did you find any connections between the 2001 disappearances and the current ones? Any common factors?" She shook her head. "That's what I was hoping you could help me determine. But there is one thing about the timing that's been bothering me." Romano pulled out a calendar and marked dates with a red pen. "The 2001 disappearances happened over exactly 14 days, August 15th, 22nd, and 29th. All on Tuesdays, exactly 1 week apart." Jake did the math in his head, feeling his stomach clench as he realized what she was suggesting. "Our current cases started on Tuesday, September 18th. Blake Patterson disappeared Wednesday night, September 19th. Tyler Jenkins Thursday night, September 20th. So the pattern has accelerated," Roberts observed grimly. "Instead of weekly disappearances, we're getting daily ones." "Which suggests," Romano added, "that whatever is causing this is intensifying, building toward something." The 3 of them sat in silence for several minutes, contemplating the disturbing possibility that they were dealing with something that had been operating from Miller's Junction for nearly 2 decades, something that had claimed at least 6 victims over the years and showed signs of accelerating its activity. Jake's radio crackled, breaking the tense silence in the interview room. "Unit 23, we've got reports of another abandoned vehicle at Miller's Junction. Black Chevrolet Silverado Texas plates." The 4th disappearance. Jake felt his stomach drop as he acknowledged the call. 4 men in less than 72 hours, following a pattern that suggested something was building toward a climax. "Ms. Romano," Robert said as they prepared to return to Miller's Junction, "I'm going to need copies of everything you've shown us, and I want you to stay available for further consultation as this investigation develops." On the drive back to the scene, Romano rode with Jake, while Roberts followed in his own vehicle. The journalist was quiet for several miles, studying her notes and occasionally making additions to her files. "Officer Morrison," she finally said, "there's something else I haven't told you. Something I found in the old files that doesn't make complete sense but might be relevant." "What is it?" "The sheriff who investigated the 2001 cases, Sheriff Brandon Hayes. He disappeared 3 months after the last Miller's Junction incident." Jake nearly swerved off the road. "Disappeared how?" His patrol car was found abandoned on Highway 6, about 10 miles from Miller's Junction. Keys in the ignition, radio still on, no signs of struggle or violence. He was never found, and the case was never solved. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Sheriff Hayes had been investigating the Miller's Junction disappearances, and 3 months later he'd become a victim himself, which raised a terrifying question. Were the investigators themselves at risk? Ms. Romano, in your research, how many law enforcement officers have disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances while investigating missing persons cases in East Texas? She was already flipping through her files, pulling out a folder marked with a different color tab. 7 that I can document over the past 20 years. 3 sheriff's deputies, 2 police officers, 1 Texas Ranger, and 1 federal agent. All were working cases involving missing persons in remote rural areas. As they approached Miller's Junction, Jake could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles surrounding the 4th abandoned vehicle. The black Silverado sat in almost the exact same position as the others, its owner nowhere to be found. But what made Jake's blood run cold was something Romano had said earlier that was just now fully sinking in. The 2001 disappearances had happened on consecutive Tuesdays, spaced exactly 1 week apart. Their current cases were happening on consecutive nights. The pattern was accelerating, but it was also approaching something, some kind of deadline or culmination. Ms. Romano, Jake said as they parked behind the newest crime scene perimeter. In your research, did you find any cases where the disappearances just stopped? Where the pattern ended on its own? She looked up from her notes with an expression that confirmed his worst fears. No, Officer Morrison. I didn't find any cases where the pattern ended naturally. The disappearances only stopped when outside factors intervened, when areas became too developed for isolation, when law enforcement presence became too heavy and sustained, when the locations became too public for whatever was happening there to continue. Jake stared at the 4th abandoned vehicle, identical to the others in every detail that mattered. 4 men had walked toward the center of Miller's Junction and vanished without a trace. A sheriff who'd tried to solve similar cases 17 years earlier had himself disappeared months later. And now Jake Morrison was primary officer on a case that was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or understand, while evidence mounted that whatever was behind the disappearances had been operating in the area for nearly 2 decades. As he approached the black Silverado to begin documenting the 4th identical crime scene, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking deeper into something that had already claimed more victims than anyone realized. Something that might not be finished claiming them. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Miller's Junction, but Jake felt a chill that seemed to emanate from the intersection itself. 4 vehicles now formed points around the crossroads like markers on some invisible map. 4 sets of footprints led to the same impossible vanishing point. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was whispering that Jake Morrison might be next. The 4th missing man was Kyle Stevens, a 31-year-old mechanic who worked at Morrison's Auto Repair in the center of town. His black Chevrolet Silverado sat abandoned on the south side of Miller's Junction, positioned with the same mechanical precision as the 3 vehicles that had preceded it. Jake Morrison spent nearly 2 hours documenting this newest crime scene, but the evidence was becoming depressingly familiar. Keys in the ignition, wallet and personal belongings left behind, cell phone with a dead battery, and footprints leading toward the center of the intersection before vanishing at the exact same spot where 3 other men's tracks had terminated. What made the Kyle Stevens case particularly disturbing was the testimony Jake gathered from the missing man's wife, Amanda. She was heavily pregnant, due to deliver their first child in less than 2 months, and the stress of her husband's disappearance was visibly taking a toll on her health. Jake interviewed Amanda Stevens at her small ranch house on the outskirts of town, with Jessica Romano present to take notes and ask follow-up questions about behavioral patterns. Amanda was a blonde woman in her late 20s, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands protectively resting on her swollen belly, fighting back tears as she described her husband's recent behavior. "He's been different for about a week now," she explained, her voice shaky with exhaustion and worry. "Distracted like his mind was somewhere else entirely. He'd be sitting right here at this table eating dinner with me, but I could tell he wasn't really present. His eyes would get this distant look, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear." "Can you be more specific about these changes?" Jake asked, making careful notes in his patrol book. "When did you first notice something was different about Kyle's behavior?" "Last Friday night. He came home from work acting strange, kept going to the window and staring out at the road like he was expecting someone. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he couldn't explain it, but he felt like he needed to drive somewhere. He didn't know where, just somewhere." Romano leaned forward in her chair. "Mrs. Stevens, did Kyle mention Miller's Junction specifically, or describe the location he felt drawn to visit?" "No, he never mentioned any specific place. But every night for the past week, after dinner, he'd get this restless energy. He'd pace around the house, check the locks on the doors, keep looking out the windows. Then around 8 or 9 o'clock, he'd announce that he needed to take a drive to clear his head." Jake exchanged a glance with Romano, recognizing the pattern she'd described from her research into the other missing persons cases. "Where did Kyle say he was going on these drives?" "He said he was just driving around, thinking about the baby and work and the future. But I knew something was wrong because when he'd come back, he'd be different. Calmer, but in a weird way. Like he'd figured something out that he couldn't share with me." "Different how?" Romano asked, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. Amanda struggled to find the words, rubbing her belly absently as she spoke. "Like he'd seen something amazing. Something that had answered questions he didn't even know he'd been asking. But when I'd ask him about it, he'd just say he'd been thinking and everything was going to be fine. His eyes, though. His eyes looked different after those drives. More focused, but focused on something I couldn't see." Jake had interviewed enough witnesses over the years to recognize when someone was trying to describe something that didn't quite make sense to them. Amanda Stevens was clearly an intelligent woman who knew her husband well, but she was struggling to articulate changes in his behavior that were outside her normal frame of reference. "Mrs. Stevens, did Kyle ever mention seeing anyone else during these drives? Meeting someone or being followed?" "No, nothing like that. He always insisted he was alone, but I noticed he was putting a lot of miles on the truck. Way more than you'd expect from just driving around town for an hour or two. The gas gauge would show he'd used nearly half a tank, which meant he was driving 50 or 60 miles each night." Jake did quick calculations in his head. Miller's Junction was about 20 miles from the Stevens house. A round trip, plus some additional driving around the area, would account for the mileage Amanda was describing. "Did you ever follow him or try to see where he was going?" Amanda's face flushed with embarrassment. "Wednesday night I tried. I was so worried about his behavior, and with the baby coming, I couldn't stand not knowing what was going on. I waited until he'd been gone about 15 minutes. Then I got in my car and drove in the direction I'd seen him go. What happened? I lost him. Kyle knows these back roads better than I do, and by the time I got to the main highway, there was no sign of his truck. I drove around for an hour looking for him, but I never found him. When I got home, he was already there, acting like nothing had happened." Romano was writing extensively in her notes. "Mrs. Stevens, when Kyle came back from these drives, did he seem to remember where he'd been? Could he describe the route he'd taken or what he'd seen? That's the strangest part. When I'd ask him about it the next morning, he'd seem confused about the details. He'd remember leaving and remember coming home, but the time in between was fuzzy, like he'd been in a trance or something." Jake felt a chill as he heard Amanda describe symptoms that sounded almost like hypnosis or some other form of psychological manipulation. Mrs. Stevens, I need to ask you about last night specifically. What time did Kyle leave, and what was his behavior like? He left around 8:30, same as the other nights, but last night was different. He seemed more agitated, more urgent. Instead of just saying he needed to drive around, he said he had to go somewhere specific. When I asked where, he said he didn't know, but he knew he'd recognize it when he saw it. Did he say anything else? Give you any other indication of where he was going or why? Amanda wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. The last thing he said to me was that everything was going to make sense soon, that all the pieces were finally coming together, and after tonight, I'd understand what had been happening to him this past week. Jake closed his patrol book and looked at Romano, who was shaking her head slightly with the expression of someone who'd heard similar stories before and knew they didn't end well. Mrs. Stevens, I need you to know that we're going to do everything possible to find Kyle. But I also need you to understand that we're dealing with something unusual here. Kyle wasn't the first person to disappear from Miller's Junction, and his behavior in the days before his disappearance matches patterns we've seen in other cases. Amanda's face went pale. Other cases? You mean this has happened before? Romano answered before Jake could respond. Mrs. Stevens, I've been researching missing persons cases across East Texas, and what you've described about Kyle's behavior, the evening drives, the distracted demeanor, the sense that he'd discovered something he couldn't explain, all of that is consistent with other disappearances we've documented. How many other cases? Including Kyle, we now have 4 men who've disappeared from Miller's Junction this week, but there have been similar disappearances from the same location 17 years ago, and possibly others going back even further. Amanda Stevens began crying in earnest, the weight of understanding that her husband was part of a larger, more sinister pattern clearly overwhelming her. Jake spent another 20 minutes with her, gathering additional details and arranging for a family member to come stay with her, given her pregnancy and the stress she was under. As Jake and Romano drove back toward Miller's Junction, they compared the information Amanda had provided with the details they'd gathered from the families of the other missing men. The pattern Romano had mentioned was becoming impossible to ignore. Every single one of them, Romano said, reviewing her notes from all 4 interviews. Marcus Henley's wife described him taking evening walks that got longer each night. Blake Patterson's landlord noticed him leaving at the same time each evening. Tyler Jenkins's co-worker mentioned he'd been distracted and talking about needing to figure something out. And now Kyle Stevens with his nightly drives. They were all being drawn to something, Jake said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he contemplated the implications. Something was calling them to Miller's Junction, night after night, until finally they didn't come back. But what could cause that kind of behavior, and why these specific men? Jake had been thinking about that question since they'd discovered the pattern. Romano, in your research on missing persons cases, have you come across any references to psychological phenomena where people become fixated on specific locations? Actually, yes. There are documented cases of people becoming obsessed with particular places without understanding why. They describe it as an irresistible compulsion, like being called by something they can't identify. Usually it's associated with trauma or significant emotional events, but sometimes... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable with where her thoughts were leading. Sometimes what? Sometimes it's described in connection with, with things that don't have scientific explanations. Alleged haunted locations, places where people report supernatural experiences, areas where multiple disappearances or deaths have occurred over time. Jake pulled over to the side of the road, needing to focus completely on what Romano was suggesting. Are you saying you think Miller's Junction is haunted? I'm saying that in my research, I've come across references to locations where people report feeling compelled to visit without understanding why. Places that seem to draw certain individuals back repeatedly until they eventually disappear. The scientific community doesn't have good explanations for these phenomena, so they tend to get dismissed as folklore or coincidence. But you don't think it's coincidence? Officer Morrison, I've documented 18 disappearances from rural East Texas locations over the past 3 years. These aren't random events. There are patterns in the victim selection, the locations, the circumstances. Something is operating in this region that goes beyond normal criminal activity. Before Jake could respond, his radio crackled with an urgent transmission from dispatch that made his blood run cold. Unit 23, we've got reports of a fifth abandoned vehicle at Miller's Junction. White Ford Explorer, Texas plates. Also, we're receiving multiple calls about unusual activity in the area. Witnesses reporting strange lights and sounds near the intersection. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he acknowledged the call. 5 vehicles now, 5 missing men, and witnesses reporting strange phenomena that suggested whatever was happening at Miller's Junction was escalating beyond anything they'd seen before. Romano, I need you to stay back when we get to the scene. If witnesses are reporting unusual activity, this could be dangerous. As they drove the final few miles to Miller's Junction, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching something that had been building toward this moment for days, possibly years. The accelerating pattern of disappearances, the increasingly strange witness reports, the complete absence of conventional evidence, it all pointed to something that was about to reach some kind of climax. The scene at Miller's Junction was unlike anything Jake had encountered in 8 years of police work. The fifth abandoned vehicle, a white Ford Explorer, sat in the same position relative to the intersection as the previous 4. But surrounding the crime scene were nearly a dozen civilians who'd driven out from town after hearing about the disappearances on local radio and television news. More disturbing were the witness statements Jake began collecting from people who claimed to have seen unusual phenomena at Miller's Junction during the afternoon and evening hours. Martha Wilson, an elderly woman who lived on a farm about 3 miles from the intersection, had called police to report lights in the sky above Miller's Junction around 6 p.m. When Jake interviewed her, she described seeing what looked like searchlights or floodlights illuminating the intersection from above, even though there were no aircraft or towers in the area. "It was like someone had set up those big stadium lights," she told Jake. "But the lights were coming from up in the sky, not from the ground. Lasted about 10 minutes, then just disappeared." Tommy Rodriguez, a teenager who'd been driving past Miller's Junction around 7 p.m., reported hearing what sounded like machinery operating near the intersection. Heavy equipment, motors, maybe generators. But when he'd stopped to investigate, he couldn't see any equipment or vehicles. "It sounded like there was major construction going on," Tommy explained. "But when I got out of my car to look around, everything was quiet. No machinery, no people, nothing. But I could swear I'd heard diesel engines and hydraulic equipment just minutes before." Most unsettling was the testimony Jake gathered from David Martinez, a county road maintenance worker who'd been driving past Miller's Junction around 8:30 p.m. and claimed to have seen a man walking toward the center of the intersection. "I slowed down because I thought maybe someone needed help," Martinez told Jake. "There was a guy in work clothes walking away from a white SUV heading toward the middle of the intersection. I was going to stop and ask if he needed assistance, but then what? Then he just wasn't there anymore. I blinked and he was gone. No trace of him, like he'd never been there at all. That's when I called 911. Jake realized that Martinez had witnessed Kyle Stevens' disappearance in real time, and his description matched the pattern they'd observed at the previous crime scenes. A man walking purposefully toward the center of Miller's Junction, then vanishing without explanation. By 10 p.m., Jake had documented the fifth identical crime scene and collected witness statements that painted a picture of escalating unusual activity at Miller's Junction throughout the day. But despite having multiple witnesses to various phenomena, they were no closer to understanding what was happening to the missing men. Texas Ranger Roberts arrived around 10:30 p.m. with additional personnel and equipment, including portable floodlights that transformed the intersection into something resembling a night construction site. But even with professional lighting and expanded search capabilities, the evidence remained stubbornly consistent with the previous cases. "Jake," Roberts said as they stood at the center of Miller's Junction where all 5 sets of footprints terminated, "I've been a law enforcement officer for 22 years, and I've never encountered anything like this. 5 men, 5 identical disappearances, multiple witnesses to unusual phenomena, and not a single piece of physical evidence that explains what happened to them." Jake stared at the spot where 5 different pairs of work boots had left their final impressions in the Texas dust. "Ranger Roberts, I keep coming back to what Romano showed us about the timing. The 2001 cases happened weekly, on Tuesdays. Our current cases are happening daily. The pattern is accelerating toward something." "Toward what?" "I don't know. But every instinct I've developed as a police officer is telling me we're running out of time to prevent whatever that something is." As if summoned by Jake's words, his radio crackled with a transmission that made everyone at the scene stop what they were doing and pay attention. All units. We're receiving reports of a massive power outage affecting a 12-mile radius around Miller's Junction. Electric company reports no equipment failures or storm damage. Cause of outage is unknown." Jake looked up at the portable floodlights that had been illuminating their crime scene. The lights were still operating, powered by their own generators, but he realized that every house, farm, and business in the surrounding area had just lost electrical power simultaneously. "Ranger Roberts," Jake said quietly, "I think we're about to find out what all of this has been building toward." In the sudden darkness that surrounded their small island of artificial light at Miller's Junction, Jake could hear sounds that shouldn't have been there, mechanical noises, electronic humming, and something that might have been voices calling from a direction he couldn't identify. The 5th disappearance had been accompanied by phenomena that suggested whatever was happening at Miller's Junction was no longer trying to remain hidden. The question was whether Jake Morrison and the other officers at the scene were about to become witnesses to something extraordinary, or whether they were about to become its next victims. The power outage that had plunged 12 square miles of rural Texas into darkness lasted exactly 17 minutes. Jake Morrison timed it precisely on his watch, from 10:47 p.m. when the last farmhouse lights visible on the horizon winked out, until 11:04 p.m. when they flickered back to life across the landscape. But those 17 minutes at Miller's Junction would haunt him for the rest of his career. During the blackout, with only the portable generators powering their crime scene floodlights, Jake and the other officers at the intersection experienced phenomena that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. It began with sounds that seemed to come from beneath their feet, mechanical humming, electronic beeping, and what sounded disturbingly like human voices speaking in languages none of them could identify. "You hear that?" Texas Ranger Roberts asked, crouching down and pressing his ear to the asphalt at the center of the intersection. Jake knelt beside him and listened. The sounds were definitely coming from underground, but they had a quality that suggested sophisticated equipment rather than natural geological phenomena. Motors, computers, maybe communication systems, all operating somewhere below the intersection, where, according to county records, there should be nothing but soil and bedrock. Jessica Romano, who'd been documenting everything with her digital recorder and camera, captured audio that would later baffle electronics experts. "It sounds like a facility," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Like there's some kind of installation operating under this intersection." But the sounds were only the beginning. At 10:52 p.m., 5 minutes into the power outage, Jake's flashlight beam caught movement at the exact spot where all 5 sets of footprints had terminated. The ground was shifting, not like an earthquake or subsidence, but like something was moving beneath the surface. "Everyone back away from the center," Jake ordered, drawing his service weapon instinctively, even though he had no idea what he might need to shoot at. As the officers and civilians retreated toward the perimeter, a circular section of asphalt about 8 feet in diameter began to sink into the ground, revealing edges that had been cut with precise industrial equipment. This wasn't natural collapse. It was a concealed entrance that was being opened from below. "What the hell is that?" Deputy Ashley Rodriguez whispered, her own weapon drawn as they watched the circular section of roadway descend like an elevator platform. Jake activated his radio, trying to call for additional backup, but discovered that all communications had been jammed. Radio, cell phones, even the satellite emergency beacon they'd brought from the ranger station. Nothing was transmitting or receiving signals. As the concealed entrance continued to open, Jake could see artificial lighting emanating from whatever space lay beneath Miller's Junction. Clean, white fluorescent illumination that revealed glimpses of metal walls, electronic equipment, and what appeared to be a staircase leading downward. "This is impossible," Roberts said, but his voice carried the tone of a man who was being forced to accept something that contradicted his understanding of the world. "There's no record of any underground construction at this location. No permits, no surveys, no indication that anything like this exists." Romano was taking photographs as quickly as her camera could cycle, documenting what might be the only evidence anyone would ever have of what lay beneath Miller's Junction. "Officer Morrison," she said urgently, "we need to get closer. We need to see what's down there." Every instinct Jake had developed as a police officer was screaming at him not to approach the opening. But 5 men had vanished from this exact spot, and whatever had taken them was apparently operating from a sophisticated underground facility that shouldn't exist. "Roberts, I'm going to take a look. Stay here and maintain perimeter security." "Jake, that's not protocol. We should wait for backup, for specialized equipment." "We don't have communications, and we don't know how long this thing will stay open," Jake interrupted. "If we're going to find out what happened to those missing men, this might be our only chance." Jake approached the opening cautiously, his flashlight and weapon both ready. At the edge of the circular entrance, he could see that the concealed platform was sophisticated engineering. Hydraulic systems, precision-cut edges, materials that looked like they belonged in an aerospace facility rather than buried under a rural Texas intersection. The stairs leading downward were metal grating, industrial-grade construction that could support significant weight. Emergency lighting strips along the walls provided illumination that extended beyond what Jake could see from the surface. This wasn't a hastily constructed hiding place. It was a permanent installation that had been built to operate for years. "I can see multiple levels," Jake called up to the others. "This goes down at least 30 feet, maybe more. There are doors, corridors, what looks like a substantial underground complex." "Any signs of the missing men?" Roberts asked. Jake descended the first flight of stairs, his boots echoing on the metal grating. The air temperature was noticeably cooler underground, and there was a sterile, recycled quality to the atmosphere that suggested sophisticated ventilation systems. At the first landing, Jake found himself facing a corridor that extended in 2 directions, with doors marked in symbols he didn't recognize. But more importantly, he found evidence of recent human presence. Fresh scuff marks on the floor, the smell of food and coffee, and, most disturbing, clothing items that looked like they belonged to the missing men. "Roberts, I've got personal effects down here. A work shirt with Morrison Auto Repair embroidered on it. That would belong to Kyle Stevens. And I can see what looks like a wallet on the floor further down the corridor." Jake continued deeper into the underground facility, following a trail of dropped personal belongings that suggested the missing men had been brought through this area recently. The construction became more sophisticated as he descended. Reinforced concrete walls, professional electrical installations, air conditioning systems that must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the second sublevel, Jake discovered something that made him stop breathing for several seconds. Through a window in one of the corridor doors, he could see a room containing 5 hospital beds, each with restraints and monitoring equipment. 4 of the beds showed signs of recent occupancy. Rumpled sheets, medical equipment that appeared to have been used, IV stands with tubing still attached. But the 5th bed was currently occupied. Jake could see a man lying motionless on the bed, connected to various monitoring devices and what appeared to be some kind of sedation system. From his position in the corridor, Jake couldn't identify the individual, but the man appeared to be alive based on the steady beeping of the cardiac monitor. "I found them," Jake spoke into his radio, forgetting that communications were jammed. "At least one of the missing men is alive down here." Jake tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The room beyond was clearly a medical facility of some kind, with equipment that looked more advanced than what he'd seen in most hospitals. The man on the occupied bed appeared to be in his early 30s, wearing a hospital gown and showing no signs of injury or trauma. He was deeply unconscious but breathing normally. Jake recognized the man as Derek Coleman, a local insurance adjuster who'd been reported missing that morning. His vehicle would presumably be the 6th abandoned car they'd find at Miller's Junction when the sun came up. As Jake checked Coleman's vital signs and looked for some way to wake him, he became aware of footsteps echoing through the corridors above. Multiple people moving through the underground facility with the confidence of individuals who knew the layout well. Jake drew his weapon and positioned himself beside the door, trying to determine how many people were approaching and whether they represented a threat. The footsteps were accompanied by voices. Calm, professional conversation between people who were clearly comfortable in this environment. "Subject 6 is stabilizing normally," a male voice said as the group approached Jake's location. "Psychological integration should be complete within 12 hours. "And the others?" asked a female voice. "Subjects 1 through 5 have been transferred to the secondary facility for processing. The local investigation is proceeding as anticipated. Authorities are baffled by the disappearances and have no viable leads." Jake felt his blood run cold as he understood that he was listening to people who were responsible for the Miller's Junction disappearances. People who referred to the missing men as subjects and who had been monitoring the police investigation of their crimes. "What about the law enforcement response?" the male voice continued. "Are we maintaining operational security?" "The containment protocol has been effective so far. Local officers are following predictable patterns, and the media attention is being managed through standard disinformation channels. However, we may need to consider expanding the operation if the investigation becomes too focused." The voices were getting closer, and Jake realized he was trapped in a room with an unconscious victim, facing an unknown number of hostile individuals who were operating a sophisticated kidnapping and imprisonment operation from beneath Miller's Junction. Jake's police training told him to radio for backup, but his communications were jammed. His training told him to retreat and regroup, but Derek Coleman was lying unconscious and helpless on the medical bed. His training told him to avoid confrontation when outnumbered, but 5 other men had already been transferred for processing to locations unknown. The footsteps stopped directly outside the room where Jake was hiding. "Gentlemen," came the female voice, "we have a problem. Our security sensors are indicating unauthorized presence in the facility. Someone has accessed the medical level." Jake pressed himself against the wall beside the door, weapon ready, knowing that his position was about to be discovered, but determined to protect Derek Coleman and gather whatever intelligence he could about the operation. The door opened, and 2 people in white medical coats entered the room. The woman was in her 40s with short gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The man was younger, perhaps early 30s, carrying a tablet computer and wearing the kind of confident expression that came from believing he was untouchable. "Officer Morrison," the woman said calmly, without even looking in his direction, "please lower your weapon. You're not in any immediate danger, and neither is Mr. Coleman." Jake spun around, keeping his pistol trained on the 2 individuals. "Police officer, you're both under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and operating an illegal facility." The woman smiled. "Officer Morrison, you're about 30 feet underground in a facility that doesn't officially exist, investigating disappearances that have no official explanation. Who exactly are you planning to call for backup?" "How do you know my name?" "We know quite a bit about you, Officer Morrison. We know about your 8 years with the Millbrook County Police, your military service record, your financial situation, your family connections. We know you've been the primary investigating officer on the Miller's Junction cases, and we know you've been working with journalist Jessica Romano to research historical disappearances. The male technician consulted his tablet. We also know that you're alone down here, that your communications are jammed, and that Texas Ranger Roberts and the other officers on the surface believe you've been underground for approximately 8 minutes. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he was being told. These people had been monitoring law enforcement activities in detail, knew the identities and backgrounds of everyone involved in the investigation, and had apparently been prepared for the possibility that someone would discover their underground facility. "What have you done with the missing men?" Jake demanded. "Subjects 1 through 5 have been transferred to our primary research facility for participation in important scientific work," the woman replied. "Their contribution to human knowledge will be significant." "What kind of research?" "Psychological conditioning studies, behavioral modification experiments, neurological response testing, the kind of research that requires volunteer subjects who can be monitored in controlled environments for extended periods." Jake felt sick as he understood what was being described. "You're conducting illegal human experimentation on kidnapped victims." "We're conducting authorized research on willing participants," the male technician corrected. "All subjects signed comprehensive consent forms before beginning their participation in our studies. Under duress, after being kidnapped and brought to an illegal underground facility, after being psychologically conditioned to recognize the value of contributing to scientific advancement," the woman said. "Officer Morrison, the men who disappeared from Miller's Junction weren't random victims. They were carefully selected based on psychological profiles that indicated receptivity to suggestion and compliance with authority figures." Jake was beginning to understand the scope of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just a kidnapping operation. It was a systematic program of human experimentation that used sophisticated psychological manipulation to acquire subjects and ensure their cooperation. "The evening drives," Jake said, pieces clicking together in his mind. "Kyle Stevens, Marcus Henley, all of them. You were conditioning them to come here voluntarily. Low-frequency audio broadcasts, subliminal messaging, carefully calibrated psychological pressure," the technician confirmed. "We identify suitable subjects, then begin a conditioning process that creates compulsive behavior patterns. Within 1 to 2 weeks, most subjects develop an irresistible urge to visit specific locations at predetermined times." Miller's Junction, one of several collection points we operate across rural America. The isolation provides security, the lack of witnesses ensures operational continuity, and the historical precedent creates useful cover for our activities. Jake realized that the 2001 disappearances Romano had discovered were part of the same operation. This underground facility had probably been operating for decades, systematically kidnapping people for illegal human experimentation while law enforcement agencies treated the disappearances as unconnected missing persons cases. "Officer Morrison," the woman said, her tone becoming more formal, "you now possess classified information about a research program that operates under federal oversight. That knowledge makes you either an asset or a security risk." "What kind of federal oversight authorizes kidnapping and human experimentation?" "The kind that recognizes the necessity of advancing human psychological and neurological science without the limitations imposed by conventional ethical restrictions." Jake understood that he was facing people who believed their research justified any methods, including systematic violation of human rights and dignity. But more immediately, he understood that his discovery of their operation put both him and Derek Coleman in mortal danger. "You're going to let us both go," Jake said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "I'm a police officer investigating missing persons cases. Other officers know where I am, and they'll be looking for me if I don't return to the surface." The technician consulted his tablet again. "Actually, Officer Morrison, our surface monitoring indicates that Texas Ranger Roberts and your other colleagues believe you've been conducting a routine inspection of what they assume is a utility maintenance area. They're not concerned about your absence, and they won't become concerned for approximately 20 more minutes." which gives us sufficient time to explain your options," the woman added. Jake kept his weapon trained on both individuals while trying to think of some way to alert the officers on the surface or to get Derek Coleman out of the underground facility safely. "Option 1, the woman continued. "You agree to participate in our research program as a voluntary subject. Your psychological profile suggests you would be an excellent candidate for authority response studies and stress conditioning experiments." "Option 2? "Option 2 is that you attempt to leave this facility and report what you've seen to your superiors, in which case you'll discover that no one will believe your account of underground installations and human experimentation programs. You'll be dismissed as an officer suffering from stress-induced delusions, possibly subjected to psychological evaluation, and eventually removed from active duty." Jake realized they were offering him the same choice that had probably been given to Sheriff Brandon Hayes 17 years earlier: join the program or be discredited and eliminated as a threat. What happened to Sheriff Hayes? "Sheriff Hayes chose option 1, the technician replied. "He made valuable contributions to our research for several years before being transferred to our primary facility." "Is he still alive?" "That information is classified." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that Jake recognized: the mechanical humming of the concealed entrance platform beginning to close. Whatever 17-minute window had allowed access to the underground facility was ending. "I'm afraid your decision time has expired, Officer Morrison," the woman said. "The facility is returning to secure mode, which means you'll be remaining here until the next operational cycle." Jake watched through the room's window as the corridor lights dimmed and emergency lighting activated. Emergency seals engaged on doors throughout the facility, and he could hear air circulation systems switching to a different operational mode. "How long until the next operational cycle?" "Approximately 6 months, the technician replied, "which provides ample time for you to consider your long-term participation in our research programs." Jake realized that he'd walked into a trap that had been operating successfully for decades. The underground facility was designed to capture not just the psychologically conditioned subjects, but also any law enforcement officers who might discover the operation. He was now a prisoner in a place that didn't officially exist, held by people who conducted illegal human experimentation with apparent government authorization, with no way to communicate with the outside world and no prospect of rescue. Above ground, Texas Ranger Roberts would eventually realize that Jake had vanished just like the 6 men they'd been investigating. The Millers Junction case would become even more mysterious, with a police officer now among the disappeared. And somewhere in the darkness of the underground facility, Derek Coleman lay unconscious on a medical table, unaware that the police officer who'd found him was now as trapped and helpless as he was. The vanishing point wasn't just a location where people disappeared. It was a sophisticated trap that had been claiming victims for years while hiding behind the facade of an unexplained mystery. Jake Morrison had come to Millers Junction to investigate missing persons. Now he was one himself, disappeared into a darkness that few people would ever believe existed. Officer Travis Coleman had always believed that small-town Texas was where good people did honest work and looked out for their neighbors. After 12 years with the Ridgeville Police Department, he thought he'd seen every type of crime their community of 8,500 residents could produce: domestic disputes, petty theft, the occasional DUI, and maybe a bar fight on Saturday nights. The worst thing that had happened during his tenure was when the high school principal had been caught embezzling money from the Booster Club, and even that had been handled quietly to avoid embarrassing the man's family. That naive faith in his community was about to be shattered on a warm October evening when Travis received what seemed like a routine call about suspicious activity at the town's water treatment facility. Ridgeville sat in the heart of ranch country, surrounded by oil fields and cattle operations that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The town had been built around agriculture and petroleum, with most of the wealth concentrated in the hands of a few prominent families who'd owned land in the area for generations. Mayor Andrew Shane's family had founded the town in 1887, and the Shane name was on half the street signs and buildings in Ridgeville. City Council member Brandon Mitchell's construction company had built most of the commercial buildings over the past decade, and School Board Chairman Derek Sterling owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. Travis had grown up in Ridgeville, graduated from the local high school, and returned after his Army service with every intention of serving his hometown until retirement. He knew everyone, trusted most people, and had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with patience, common sense, and the occasional firm conversation. The complexity of big city crime, organized conspiracies, systematic corruption, criminal enterprises that crossed jurisdictional boundaries seemed like problems that belonged in other places, not in the community where his grandfather had been sheriff for 20 years. That comfortable certainty changed at 9:47 p.m. on October 15th, when dispatch sent him to investigate reports of unusual activity at the water treatment plant on the east side of town. The caller hadn't left a name, just reported seeing vehicles at the facility outside of normal business hours, and requested that police check on the situation. The water treatment plant sat on a 10-acre lot surrounded by chain-link fencing, with several large concrete buildings housing filtration equipment and chemical storage tanks. During the day, it was staffed by 3 technicians who monitored the system that provided clean water to every home and business in Ridgeville. But at night, it should have been completely automated and unoccupied, with only basic security lighting and remote monitoring equipment operating. As Travis pulled up to the main gate, he immediately noticed something unusual. The facility was normally lit by security lights at night, but now it was almost completely dark. Only a few dim emergency lights were visible inside the buildings, and the main office appeared to be unoccupied. More concerning were the tire tracks in the gravel parking area. Fresh tracks from at least 3 different vehicles, including what looked like a large truck or delivery van. The tracks led to a service entrance on the side of the main building, an entrance that should have been locked and secured after business hours. Travis radioed his position to dispatch and began a perimeter check of the facility. The main gate was locked, but he found a section of the security fence that had been cut and carefully repaired with wire ties. Someone had created a hidden entrance that would be almost invisible during casual inspection, but would allow easy access for people who knew where to look. Standard protocol required Travis to call for backup before investigating further, but Ridgeville's small police force was stretched thin that evening. His partner, Nicole, was responding to a domestic disturbance on the other side of town that had already escalated to the point where she'd requested additional units. The night shift supervisor was dealing with a traffic accident on the highway that involved potential DUI charges and required extensive documentation. Travis could request that an off-duty officer be called in, but that would take at least 30 minutes, and he wasn't sure the situation warranted that level of response. Travis made the decision to conduct a preliminary investigation, planning to call for support if he found anything that clearly warranted deeper involvement. Using the cut section of fence, he entered the facility grounds and approached the main building. The service door he'd identified was indeed unlocked, with fresh scratches around the lock mechanism suggesting it had been recently picked or forced open. Travis drew his weapon and entered the building, announcing himself as police and requesting that anyone inside identify themselves. The interior of the water treatment facility was a maze of pipes, tanks, and monitoring equipment that Travis had seen a few times during community tours, but in the dark, with only his flashlight for illumination, the normally familiar space felt ominous and confusing. As he moved deeper into the building, Travis began to notice things that didn't belong in a municipal water treatment facility. Extension cords running to areas where there shouldn't be any electrical equipment. The smell of chemicals that didn't match the chlorine and treatment compounds he was familiar with from previous visits. And most disturbing, the sound of voices coming from somewhere deeper in the complex, too muffled to make out words, but clearly indicating that people were present and working. Following the voices, Travis made his way toward the rear of the building where the main filtration tanks were located. As he got closer, he could make out at least 3 different speakers, their conversation urgent but quiet, like people trying to avoid detection while discussing important business. At the entrance to the filtration room, Travis positioned himself to observe without being seen. What he witnessed made no sense in the context of legitimate water treatment operations. 3 men in civilian clothes were working around the main water tank, connecting equipment that definitely didn't belong in a municipal water system. Boxes of what appeared to be chemical compounds were stacked nearby, along with digital scales, measuring devices, and monitoring equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything the city normally used. Most disturbing was the careful, methodical way the men were working. This wasn't sabotage or vandalism, but a carefully planned operation being conducted by people who clearly understood both the facility's systems and their own objectives. One of the men turned toward Travis's position, and he immediately recognized the face. It was Brandon Mitchell, one of the town's most respected businessmen and a member of the city council. Mitchell owned the largest construction company in the county and had built most of the commercial buildings in Ridgeville over the past decade. He was also married to Travis's cousin Sarah and had been a guest at family gatherings for years. Travis felt his worldview tilting as he tried to process what he was seeing. A city council member, someone he'd known personally for most of his adult life, was apparently involved in some kind of unauthorized activity at the water treatment facility. But what could Brandon Mitchell possibly want with the town's water supply? And why would he be conducting this operation in secret after hours with what appeared to be illegal entry? The answer came when Travis managed to get close enough to overhear part of their conversation. "The test results from the county lab came back clean," one of the men was saying, consulting a clipboard with what looked like scientific data. "No detection in any of the standard monitoring protocols. We can increase the concentration by another 15% without triggering the automated alarm systems." "Good," replied Mitchell. "We need to maintain those levels for at least another month. The preliminary environmental impact studies are scheduled to begin in November, and everything needs to be in compliance by then." "What about the state health department samples?" asked the third man, whom Travis now recognized as Kyle Walsh from the County Planning Commission. "Already taken care of," Mitchell responded. "Dr. Sarah at the County Health Laboratory knows what results to report. We've got complete coverage on that end of the operation." Travis realized he was witnessing something far more serious than vandalism or even theft. These men were deliberately contaminating Ridgeville's water supply, and they had inside help from both the county health department and the laboratory that was supposed to monitor water quality. But contaminating it with what? And why would respected members of the community be involved in something that could harm every resident of the town? As he tried to get closer to hear more of their conversation, Travis stepped on a piece of loose equipment that clanged against the concrete floor. The sound echoed through the facility like a gunshot, and all 3 men immediately stopped talking and looked in his direction. "Someone's here," Mitchell said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "Check the perimeter. Find out who's listening." Travis found himself in an impossible situation. He was alone, outnumbered 3-1, and apparently dealing with a conspiracy that involved at least 1 city council member and 1 county official. His radio might not work reliably inside the building's concrete structure, and backup was at least 20 minutes away, even if he could call for help. Worse, these weren't strangers or obvious criminals. They were people he knew, people whose children went to school with his neighbor's kids, people he'd worked with on community projects. Making a quick decision, Travis began to retreat toward the entrance, hoping to get outside where he could call for assistance and set up surveillance of the facility. But as he moved through the maze of equipment, he heard footsteps spreading out through the building. The men were conducting an organized search, and they clearly knew the facility's layout better than he did. Travis made it to within 50 feet of the exit when a flashlight beam caught him full in the face, temporarily blinding him and destroying his night vision. "Police officer," came a voice from the darkness behind the light. "Lower your weapon and put your hands where I can see them." Blinking away the spots from the bright light, Travis found himself facing two of the men, both now armed with pistols that looked professional rather than civilian. The third man, Brandon Mitchell, emerged from behind a filtration tank with his own weapon drawn, but his expression showed more disappointment than surprise, as if this confrontation was something he'd been expecting. "Officer Coleman," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a tone of regret rather than hostility. "I wish you hadn't seen this. I really wish you hadn't gotten involved." "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to explain what's going on here," Travis replied, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the surreal circumstances. "Why are you in the water treatment facility after hours? And what are those chemicals you're adding to the municipal water supply?" Mitchell exchanged glances with his two companions before responding. "Travis, you've always been a good officer. Honest, dedicated, loyal to this community. That's why this situation is so unfortunate for everyone involved. Sir, I'm going to need you and these men to come with me to the station for questioning. There are clearly violations of municipal codes here at minimum, and possibly much more serious crimes." "You don't understand the situation, Travis," Mitchell interrupted, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something complex to a child. "This isn't a crime. This is business. Important business that's worth more money than you can possibly imagine." Kyle Walsh stepped forward, and Travis recognized him now as someone he'd worked with on zoning issues and development permits. "Brandon, we can't let him leave here with this information, not knowing what he knows now." Travis felt adrenaline flood his system as he realized the true danger of his situation. These weren't ordinary criminals who might flee when confronted by police. These were established members of the community who had too much invested in whatever operation they were running to let a police officer expose it. "Gentlemen, let's think about this carefully," Travis said, trying to keep his voice steady and project more confidence than he felt. "I'm a police officer investigating suspicious activity. Other officers know where I am and will be looking for me if I don't check in on schedule. The best thing for everyone is to cooperate with this investigation." Mitchell shook his head slowly, like a teacher correcting a student's wrong answer. "Travis, no one knows you're here. You didn't call for backup before entering the facility. You didn't report your entry to dispatch. Your radio won't work reliably inside this building due to the concrete construction and the electrical interference from our equipment, and everyone in the department knows you prefer to work alone when you can." The accuracy of Mitchell's assessment sent a chill through Travis. These men had clearly been watching police operations, studying patrol patterns and procedures, maybe for weeks or months. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. It was part of a long-term plan that had taken law enforcement response into account. "What do you want with the water supply?" Travis asked, still hoping to understand what he'd stumbled into. "What are those chemicals you're adding to the system?" "It's not what we're adding," Mitchell replied, his tone becoming more businesslike. "It's what we're preparing for. Travis, Ridgeville sits on one of the largest natural gas deposits in East Texas, the kind of deposit that could make everyone in this town wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But there's been one significant obstacle to developing that resource." He gestured toward the filtration equipment around them. "Environmental regulations. The extraction methods we want to use would normally contaminate the groundwater and fail every EPA compliance test. But if the water supply already showed certain chemical signatures before we started drilling, if there were pre-existing contamination patterns in the municipal system..." Travis felt sick as he understood the implication. "You're pre-contaminating the water supply to hide industrial pollution that hasn't happened yet. We're preparing the regulatory environment for economic development that will transform this community," Mitchell corrected firmly. When the gas extraction begins next year, the environmental impact studies will show that any chemical signatures detected in groundwater samples were already present in the municipal water supply. No violations, no fines, no delays in development. And everyone in town is drinking contaminated water in the meantime. Carefully calculated low-level contamination, Walsh added, as if that made the situation more acceptable. Precisely measured to avoid immediate health effects while creating the chemical baseline we need for regulatory compliance. Most people will never experience any symptoms at all. Most people? Travis repeated, horror growing in his voice as he understood what Walsh was implying. Mitchell's expression hardened, and Travis could see the businessman calculating costs and benefits with the same cold logic he probably applied to construction contracts. Travis, you have a choice to make. You can join us and share in the prosperity that's coming to Ridgeville, or you can continue to be a problem that needs to be solved. The natural gas development is going to happen either way. The only question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the obstacle. Looking into the faces of these three men, people he'd known and trusted for years, respected members of his community who were apparently willing to poison their neighbors for profit, Travis realized that his entire understanding of Ridgeville had been built on lies and assumptions. The good people doing honest work, the neighbors looking out for each other, the community values he'd spent his career protecting. It had all been a facade hiding something monstrous. I can't be part of this, Travis said quietly. I took an oath to protect the people of this community, and that's what I'm going to do. Mitchell nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that response. I was afraid you'd say that, Travis. I really was hoping we could work something out. The sound of footsteps echoed through the facility as more people entered the building. Travis turned to see Mayor Andrew Shane walking toward them, flanked by two other men Travis didn't recognize. Shane was dressed casually despite the late hour, suggesting he'd been expecting to be called to the water treatment plant. Officer Coleman, the mayor said formally, his voice carrying the authority of his office. I understand we have a problem here. The presence of Mayor Shane at the water treatment facility transformed Travis's understanding of what he was facing from a criminal conspiracy involving a few corrupt businessmen into something that reached the highest levels of Ridgeville's government. The mayor's calm demeanor and the organized way he'd arrived with additional personnel suggested this was a scenario they'd planned for, a contingency they'd hoped wouldn't be necessary but were prepared to implement if discovered. Mr. Mayor, Travis said, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the surreal circumstances of finding himself held at gunpoint by people he'd known and trusted for years. I need you to explain what's happening here. As a sworn law enforcement officer, I have an obligation to report violations of municipal code and potential crimes against public health and safety. Shane approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd dealt with crisis situations before. Travis, I understand this looks bad from your perspective, but you're missing the bigger picture. What we're doing here isn't a crime. It's preparing Ridgeville for the most significant economic opportunity in our town's history. The two men flanking the mayor moved to positions that effectively blocked all exits from the filtration room, making Travis acutely aware that he was now surrounded and outnumbered 6-1. But what disturbed him more than the tactical disadvantage was the realization that these weren't strangers who'd invaded his community. These were people he'd voted for, people whose children played on the same Little League teams as his neighbors' kids, people he'd shared meals with at community events and church functions. Travis, Mitchell said, stepping forward with his weapon now lowered but still ready, let me explain what's really at stake here because I think you're focusing on the wrong things. The natural gas deposit under Ridgeville isn't just valuable, it's generational wealth. We're talking about enough money to transform every family in this town, to fund schools and infrastructure projects that would make Ridgeville a model community for rural economic development. But only if we can extract it without running into environmental complications, Shane added, his voice taking on the persuasive tone Travis had heard him use during city council meetings and public forums. The EPA regulations are designed to prevent exactly the kind of large-scale extraction we need to make this profitable, unless there's already a documented baseline of certain chemical signatures that would make the extraction impact negligible by comparison. Travis felt sick as the full scope of their plan became clear. You're poisoning the entire town to create legal cover for industrial pollution that will make you rich. How many people are you willing to hurt for this gas money? The chemical concentrations we're introducing are carefully calculated, Walsh interjected, pulling out a tablet computer and consulting what appeared to be scientific data. We brought in consultants from Houston, specialists in environmental chemistry and toxicology. The contamination levels are designed to create the regulatory baseline we need while staying below the threshold for immediate or obvious health effects. Immediate health effects, Travis repeated, his voice carrying the horror he felt at what Walsh was casually describing. What about long-term effects? What about children, elderly people, pregnant women? What about people with compromised immune systems or existing health conditions? The uncomfortable silence that followed his question told Travis everything he needed to know about how much consideration they'd given to the human cost of their scheme. These men had calculated profit margins and regulatory requirements and legal liability, but they hadn't spent much time thinking about the 8-year-old girl down the street who'd been battling leukemia, or the elderly widow next door who was already struggling with diabetes and heart disease. Shane finally answered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd rehearsed justifications for difficult decisions. Travis, every development project involves calculated risks. The wealth this gas extraction will generate will more than pay for any healthcare costs that might arise. We'll have the resources to build the best medical facility in East Texas, to provide healthcare services that these families could never afford otherwise. That's assuming they survive to use it, Travis shot back. One of the men who'd arrived with Shane stepped forward. Travis recognized him now as Derek Sterling, who owned the largest ranch in the county and served on the school board. Sterling was also the father of 2 children who attended Ridgeville Elementary, which made his willingness to contaminate the town's water supply even more disturbing. "Officer Coleman, you're thinking about this all wrong," Sterling said, his voice carrying the patient condescension of someone explaining something obvious to a slow student. "This isn't about hurting people. It's about helping them. Ridgeville has been slowly dying for 20 years. Young people leave for Dallas or Houston because there's no economic future here. Businesses close because there's no customer base. Property values decline because there's no demand. This gas development will reverse all of those trends, bringing prosperity and opportunity back to our community. By slowly poisoning everyone who lives here. By creating the regulatory conditions necessary for economic development," Sterling corrected firmly. "The contamination is temporary and minimal. Once the extraction operation begins, we'll implement state-of-the-art water treatment systems, the best technology money can buy. The water supply will actually be cleaner after development than it is now." Travis was struggling to process how these seemingly normal people, many of whom had families of their own in Ridgeville, could rationalize mass poisoning as community improvement. But he was beginning to understand that they genuinely believed their own justifications, that they'd convinced themselves that temporary harm to some people was acceptable if it led to long-term prosperity for the community. "How long has this been going on?" Travis asked. "How long have you been contaminating the water supply?" Mitchell consulted a notebook from his jacket pocket, flipping through pages of what appeared to be detailed records and schedules. "We began Phase 1 in July with low-level introduction to establish baseline readings in the municipal system. Phase 2 started in September with increased concentrations designed to reach target contamination levels. We're currently in Phase 3, maintaining those levels until the preliminary environmental studies are completed in November." 4 months, Travis said, feeling the weight of what Mitchell was telling him. "You've been poisoning the town for 4 months." "We've been preparing for development," Shane corrected with the firmness of someone who'd had this argument before. "And the results have been exactly what our consultants predicted. No significant increase in hospital visits, no patterns of illness that would indicate problems with the water supply. The monitoring has been comprehensive and continuous." "What monitoring?" Travis demanded, sensing that there were more people involved in this conspiracy than he'd initially realized. "Dr. Sarah Martinez at the County Health Laboratory has been tracking all relevant health indicators," Walsh explained, consulting his tablet again. "Blood work from routine physical examinations, emergency room visits, school nurse reports, veterinary data from local animal clinics. Every metric that could indicate water quality problems. Everything has remained within normal statistical parameters." The mention of Dr. Martinez hit Travis like a physical blow. Sarah Martinez had been his family's doctor for 8 years. She'd treated his father's diabetes, his mother's blood pressure, had been a trusted and respected member of their community. Now he was learning she was complicit in a conspiracy to contaminate the water supply of the people who trusted her with their health. "How many people are involved in this operation?" Travis asked. "Everyone who needs to be," Shane replied, his answer both evasive and ominous. "This isn't some hastily organized criminal enterprise, Travis. This is a comprehensive development plan involving the top geological, environmental, and medical expertise we could afford. Every aspect has been carefully considered and professionally planned." Travis realized that what he was facing wasn't just a criminal conspiracy. It was a complete shadow government operating within Ridgeville's official institutions. These people had systematically identified every position that could potentially interfere with their plan and had either bought off, replaced, or neutralized the people in those positions. "What about the police department? Is Chief Anderson involved in this?" The hesitation before Shane answered told Travis more than any words could have. Chief Anderson had been Travis's mentor and friend for 12 years, the man who'd hired him, trained him, and guided his development as a police officer. The possibility that Anderson was part of this conspiracy felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than anything else he'd learned. "The chief has been supportive of economic development initiatives," Shane said carefully, his diplomatic language revealing nothing definitive but suggesting everything Travis feared. "That's not an answer." Mitchell stepped closer, his expression showing what might have been genuine regret. "Travis, Chief Anderson knows that major industrial development is coming to Ridgeville. He's been briefed on the security and logistical challenges that will involve the need for additional personnel and equipment to handle increased traffic and potential protests. But he hasn't been given details about the preliminary environmental preparation work we're doing. So he doesn't know you're poisoning people. He doesn't know about the baseline establishment program," Shane corrected, his voice becoming more formal, "because his knowledge of those details isn't necessary for his role in the overall project. Everyone involved knows only what they need to know to fulfill their specific responsibilities." Travis understood now why he'd been caught so completely off guard by what he'd discovered. The conspiracy was organized with military-style compartmentalization, where most participants didn't understand the full scope of what they were involved in. This approach would make people more willing to participate and less likely to develop ethical qualms about their contributions to the overall operation. "What's my role supposed to be in this project?" Travis asked. Sterling smiled, and Travis could see the man was genuinely pleased to be discussing what he obviously considered a generous opportunity. "Security and crowd control during the construction phase. Industrial development on this scale always generates protests from environmental groups and outside agitators, and we'll need experienced law enforcement officers to maintain order and protect our workers and equipment. It's a consulting position that could easily be worth an additional $50,000 per year." $50,000. Travis thought about his modest police salary, his aging patrol car, the student loans he was still paying off from his criminal justice degree, the small apartment he rented because he couldn't afford a down payment on a house. In a town like Ridgeville, an extra $50,000 a year would transform his financial situation completely. But it would also make him complicit in the systematic poisoning of every person he'd sworn to protect and serve. "I can't do this," Travis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't be part of poisoning my own community for money." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The pretense of friendly persuasion evaporated, replaced by the cold calculation of people who'd moved past trying to recruit Travis and were now focused on neutralizing him as a threat. "Travis," Shane said quietly, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering bad news, "you need to understand that this development is going to happen whether you help us or not. The federal permits are already in process. The environmental studies are scheduled to begin next month. The investment capital has been committed by energy companies that have more resources than you can imagine. The only question is whether you're going to be part of Ridgeville's prosperous future or not. Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality," Shane replied, his mayoral authority lending weight to his words. "You've seen something tonight that you weren't supposed to see. You know details about a legitimate business operation that could be misinterpreted if taken out of context and presented to people who don't understand the full scope of what we're trying to accomplish. That knowledge makes you either an asset or a liability." Walsh stepped forward, consulting his tablet as if Travis was a problem to be solved through careful data analysis. "Officer Coleman, we've researched your background extensively. You're a good man, a dedicated officer, someone who cares deeply about this community and its future. That's exactly the kind of person we want on our team. But if you're not on the team," Sterling added, his voice carrying unmistakable menace despite his calm tone, "if you're determined to interfere with something that will benefit every person in Ridgeville, then you become a threat to the welfare of 8,500 people." Travis realized they were offering him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Join the conspiracy or be eliminated as a threat to it. "What happened to the anonymous caller?" Travis asked. "Someone called in reports of suspicious activity at this facility tonight. Where are they now?" The silence that followed his question was more ominous than any direct threat they could have made. Finally, Mitchell answered with the kind of careful precision that suggested he'd been prepared for this question. "There was no anonymous caller, Travis. We made that call ourselves. You." "What?" "We needed to evaluate your response to reports of unusual activity at a critical municipal facility," Walsh explained, his tone suggesting this was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. "Whether you would follow proper procedure and wait for backup, or whether you would investigate alone, whether you could be trusted to be discreet about sensitive matters, or whether you would create complications for legitimate business operations." Travis felt the world shifting around him as he understood what had happened. "This was a test. You set me up. We needed to assess your suitability for the security consulting position," Shane confirmed, "and unfortunately your actions tonight have raised serious concerns about your ability to work effectively within a team structure." "My actions? I responded to reports of suspicious activity at a municipal facility. I did my job exactly as I was trained to do it." "You investigated alone without calling for backup," Walsh pointed out, consulting his notes. "You entered a secured building without proper authorization. You drew your weapon in a situation that didn't warrant the use of deadly force. Your judgment and decision-making process raise questions about your reliability and professional competence." Travis stared at these men who were systematically rewriting reality to justify their actions. They'd manipulated him into a situation where every correct professional decision could be twisted into evidence of poor judgment, where his dedication to duty became proof of his unfitness for duty. "This is insane," he said. "You're rewriting reality to justify keeping me quiet about your crimes." "We're documenting a police officer's erratic behavior during a routine security evaluation," Sterling replied calmly. behavior that suggests he may not be psychologically fit for duty in his current position. The implications hit Travis immediately. They weren't just planning to silence him, they were planning to discredit him. If he tried to report what he'd seen, they would counter with documentation of his erratic behavior and psychological instability. His word against the mayor, a city council member, a school board member, and a county planning commissioner. His career would be over, his credibility destroyed, and the water contamination would continue. "You've thought of everything," Travis said. "We've planned comprehensively," Shane agreed. "Because too much is at stake to leave anything to chance. The future of this community, the prosperity of thousands of families, the economic survival of Ridgeville itself. All of that depends on this project succeeding." Travis looked around the room at these 6 men who represented the power structure of his hometown. Men he'd trusted, respected, some he'd even voted for. Men who were calmly discussing the best way to handle a police officer who'd discovered their plan to poison 8,000 people for profit. "I need time to think about this," Travis said, knowing that any decision he made would fundamentally change the rest of his life. "Of course," Shane replied reasonably. "But Travis, you need to understand that your thinking time is limited. The project timeline doesn't allow for extended delays or complications. We'll need your decision within 24 hours. "And if I decide I can't be part of this operation?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Sterling answered with the kind of euphemistic language that didn't disguise the underlying threat. "Then we'll have to manage you as a risk to the project." Travis understood that managing him as a risk could mean anything from forced early retirement to something far more permanent. These people had too much invested in their operation to let one police officer interfere with plans that could generate millions of dollars in profit. 24 hours, Shane repeated. "Meet us tomorrow night at the same time, same place, with your decision." As the 6 men began to file out of the facility, Mitchell paused beside Travis. Despite everything that had happened, his expression seemed to carry genuine regret. "For what it's worth, Travis, I hope you make the right choice. Ridgeville needs good police officers, and you've always been one of the best." "I've always been honest," Travis replied. "That's not going to change." Mitchell's expression darkened. "Travis, honesty is a luxury we can't afford right now. Too much money, too many jobs, too many families' futures depend on this project succeeding. Sometimes the greater good requires individuals to make personal sacrifices." After the men left, Travis remained alone in the water treatment facility, surrounded by the evidence of their contamination operation. The chemical storage containers, the monitoring equipment, the careful documentation of their systematic poisoning program. It was all still there, hidden in plain sight within a municipal facility that every resident of Ridgeville trusted to provide them with safe drinking water. Travis took photographs of everything he could document with his phone, though he suspected the evidence would be removed or destroyed long before he could present it to any authority who might take action. These people had been planning for months or years. They wouldn't have overlooked the possibility of photographic evidence. As he made his way back to his patrol car, Travis tried to process the impossible situation he found himself in. He was a police officer who'd discovered a criminal conspiracy involving the mayor, city council, school board, and county health department. The people he would normally report crimes to were the criminals. The evidence he'd gathered would be dismissed as the fabrications of an unstable officer who'd violated protocol and entered a secured facility without authorization. Worse, he was now faced with a choice that would define the rest of his life: join the conspiracy and become complicit in mass poisoning, or resist and face elimination as a threat to a project worth millions of dollars. Travis sat in his patrol car for nearly an hour, staring at the water treatment facility and trying to find some way out of the trap these men had constructed around him. Every option he considered led to the same conclusion. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of legal alternatives. Finally, he started the engine and began the drive back to town. As he drove through the quiet streets of Ridgeville, past houses where families were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their water supply had been deliberately contaminated for 4 months, Travis realized that the weight of their lives was now resting squarely on his shoulders. 8,500 people were drinking poison every day, and he was the only one who knew it, the only one in a position to do anything about it, the only one who could choose between saving them and saving himself. By the time Travis reached his apartment, he'd made his decision. It wasn't the smart choice, wasn't the safe choice, probably wasn't even the survivable choice, but it was the right choice. And for a police officer who'd sworn an oath to protect and serve his community, that would have to be enough, even if it killed him. Travis spent the night at his kitchen table, surrounded by maps of Ridgeville's water distribution system and what little documentation he could find about municipal water quality standards. The photographs on his phone showed clear evidence of the contamination operation, but he knew they would be worthless without corroborating testimony or official documentation that he had no way to access without exposing himself to the very people who were running the conspiracy. By 4 a.m., Travis had reached several disturbing conclusions about the scope of what he was facing. The natural gas development project would require coordination with state environmental agencies, federal permit offices, and major energy corporations. The money involved wasn't just local wealth. It was institutional investment capital that would involve lawyers, accountants, and regulatory specialists across multiple states. These weren't small-town criminals who'd gotten in over their heads. They were the local implementation team for a sophisticated, well-funded operation that had probably been in development for years before the first chemicals were added to Ridgeville's water supply. Travis's phone rang at 6:15 a.m. Chief Anderson's name appeared on the display, and Travis felt his stomach clench as he answered. "Travis, I need you to come in early today. We've got some administrative matters to discuss." "Yes, sir. What kind of administrative matters?" "Personnel issues. I'll explain when you get here." Travis felt his pulse quicken as he ended the call. Personnel issues at 6:15 a.m. on a Friday morning probably meant they'd decided not to wait 24 hours for his answer. The conspiracy was moving faster than they'd indicated the night before, which suggested something had changed since their meeting at the water treatment facility. When Travis arrived at the police station, he found Chief Anderson waiting in his office with 2 men Travis didn't recognize. Both were wearing expensive suits despite the early hour, and they had the unmistakable bearing of corporate executives or government officials, people accustomed to wielding authority and getting results. "Travis, sit down," Chief Anderson said, his tone formal and uncomfortable, lacking the easy familiarity they'd shared for 12 years. "These gentlemen are from Sterling Environmental Consulting. They're conducting a security assessment for some upcoming industrial development in our area." The taller of the 2 men extended his hand with the practiced smoothness of someone who made his living managing difficult situations. "Officer Coleman, I'm Marcus Webb, Director of Security Operations. This is my colleague Austin Hayes, our legal counsel." Travis shook their hands while studying their faces and trying to assess what kind of threat they represented. Webb had the build and posture of former military or law enforcement, probably someone who'd moved into private security after a government career. Hayes looked like corporate legal, expensive suit, calculated smile, eyes that revealed nothing about his thoughts or intentions. "Gentlemen, I'm not sure what this is about, but I've got patrol duties to attend to." "Actually, Travis, you're on administrative leave as of this morning," Chief Anderson said, avoiding Travis's eyes as he delivered the news. "These gentlemen have raised some concerns about your conduct during last night's incident at the water treatment facility." Travis felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. They'd moved much faster than expected, bringing in outside specialists to handle the situation with professional efficiency. "What concerns?" Hayes consulted a legal pad with what appeared to be carefully prepared notes. "Officer Coleman, You entered a secured municipal facility without authorization from the appropriate oversight agencies. You drew your service weapon in the absence of any apparent threat to public safety. You failed to follow proper protocols for investigating suspicious activity reports. These actions raise serious questions about your judgment and your psychological fitness for duty. I was responding to a report of suspicious activity at a critical infrastructure facility. My actions were entirely appropriate for the circumstances as I understood them. What suspicious activity? Webb asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who already knew the answer and was testing Travis's response. Our investigation shows that the facility was being used for legitimate maintenance operations by authorized personnel. No crimes were committed, no municipal codes were violated, no public safety issues were identified. You appear to have misinterpreted routine municipal maintenance as criminal activity. Travis stared at these men who were rewriting reality with professional efficiency, supported by documentation that would probably appear completely legitimate to anyone who wasn't aware of the true situation. I witnessed chemical contamination equipment. I heard conversations about poisoning the water supply. Hayes made notes on his legal pad. Officer Coleman, do you have any training or certification in water treatment systems? Any technical expertise that would allow you to distinguish between legitimate water treatment equipment and what you call contamination equipment? I know the difference between normal operations and... You know the difference based on what training? Webb interrupted. What specialized education gives you the authority to determine what equipment belongs in a municipal water treatment facility? Travis realized they were systematically undermining every aspect of his testimony by questioning his qualifications and expertise. By the time they finished, anything he said would sound like the uninformed opinions of an officer who'd misunderstood what he was seeing. Chief Anderson leaned forward, his expression showing what appeared to be genuine concern. Travis, these gentlemen are recommending a comprehensive psychological evaluation. They're concerned that the stress of police work may be affecting your perception of routine situations. Chief, you've known me for 12 years. Do you think I'm having psychological problems? Anderson's uncomfortable silence lasted several seconds too long, and when he finally answered, Travis could hear the careful phrasing of someone who'd been coached on what to say. Travis, I think you've been working too many night shifts, dealing with too much stress, maybe not getting enough sleep. A psychological evaluation would be good for everyone. It would either confirm that you're fine and clear up these concerns, or it would identify issues that we can address before they become serious problems. And if I refuse the evaluation? Hayes answered with the smooth professionalism of someone who'd delivered similar ultimatums many times before. Officer Coleman, based on your actions last night, you're facing potential criminal charges for breaking and entering, trespassing on municipal property, and interfering with legitimate municipal operations. The psychological evaluation is being offered as an alternative to criminal prosecution. The threat was clear and professionally delivered. Submit to evaluation and potential forced treatment, or face criminal charges that would destroy his career and credibility permanently. How long would this evaluation take? Travis asked. Standard protocol calls for a 72-hour observation period, Webb replied, during which time you would be confined to a secure medical facility for comprehensive psychological testing and evaluation. 72 hours. 3 days during which Travis would be locked away while the conspiracy completed whatever timeline they were working toward. By the time he was released, the evidence would be gone, the contamination operation would be finished, and he'd be a discredited police officer with a documented history of mental health issues. I need to think about this, Travis said. I'm afraid the offer has a time limit, Hayes replied, consulting his watch as if timing was a crucial factor. The alternative criminal charges need to be filed within 24 hours of the incident. You have until 6 p.m. today to make your decision. Travis looked at Chief Anderson, hoping to see some sign that his mentor and friend was being coerced or manipulated. But Anderson's expression was carefully neutral, giving away nothing about his true thoughts or loyalties. Chief, can I speak with you privately? Anderson nodded, and the two consultants stepped outside his office, closing the door behind them. Travis, I need you to tell me honestly. Are you having any personal problems? Stress, depression, family issues, anything that might affect your judgment or decision-making? Chief, I need you to tell me honestly. Do you know what's really happening at the water treatment facility? Anderson stared at him for a long moment, and Travis could see internal conflict in his expression. Travis, I know that economic development is coming to Ridgeville. Major development, the kind that will create jobs and bring prosperity to this community. And I know that sometimes good people can get confused about what constitutes criminal activity versus what constitutes legitimate business operations. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now. Travis understood that Chief Anderson was either part of the conspiracy or had been neutralized as effectively as Travis himself was being neutralized. Either way, he was alone. When the consultants returned, Travis made his decision. I'll take the psychological evaluation. Smart choice, Webb said, and Travis could hear genuine approval in his voice. Transportation has been arranged. You'll be taken to a facility in Houston where qualified professionals can properly assess your condition. When? Now, Hayes replied, as if there had never been any other possibility. The evaluation needs to begin immediately to be completed within the legal time frame for filing charges. Travis realized he was being kidnapped under the guise of medical treatment. Once he was in Houston, in a facility controlled by people working for the conspiracy, there was no telling when or if he'd be released. I need to go home first, pack some clothes, make arrangements for someone to check on my apartment. Already taken care of, Webb said smoothly. Your personal effects will be brought to the facility. Someone from the department will handle your apartment and any other responsibilities you have here. They weren't even pretending anymore that this was voluntary. Travis was being forcibly removed from Ridgeville before he could interfere with their operation. As they escorted him from the police station, Travis caught sight of Officer Nicole Martinez arriving for her morning shift. She looked confused and concerned to see him leaving with strangers in suits. But before she could approach or ask questions, Chief Anderson intercepted her and began explaining something in low, urgent tones. The last thing Travis saw as they drove away from the Ridgeville Police Department was Nicole's shocked expression as she realized what was happening to her partner and friend. The drive to Houston took 3 hours, during which Webb and Hayes made polite conversation about the weather, the oil industry, and the economic development opportunities in rural Texas. They seemed genuinely friendly, as if they were colleagues heading to a business meeting rather than men who were effectively kidnapping a police officer to prevent him from exposing a mass poisoning operation. The facility they took him to was a private psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of Houston, the kind of place that catered to wealthy clients who needed discreet treatment for problems that might damage their reputations if made public. The staff was professional, courteous, and clearly accustomed to handling patients who weren't there entirely voluntarily. Dr. Amanda Phillips, the psychiatrist who conducted Travis's intake interview, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put patients at ease. But Travis noticed that she took extensive notes about everything he said, and her questions seemed designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as evidence of paranoid delusions or psychological instability. Officer Coleman, can you tell me about the events that led to your evaluation? I discovered evidence of a conspiracy to contaminate my town's water supply and was threatened when I tried to report it to my superiors. Dr. Phillips wrote extensively in her notes. When you say conspiracy, can you describe who you believe was involved? The mayor, a city council member, county officials, and several local businessmen. People in positions of authority who were working together to poison the municipal water system. More detailed notes. And what evidence did you observe of water system contamination? Chemical storage containers that didn't belong in a water treatment facility, monitoring equipment being used to track contamination levels, and conversations about maintaining poison levels to avoid detection by regulatory authorities. "Officer Coleman, do you have any specialized training in chemistry or water treatment systems that would allow you to identify contamination equipment?" Travis realized that every answer he gave was being filtered through the assumption that he was having paranoid delusions. The truth sounded insane when presented in a clinical context, especially when told by someone who'd been forcibly committed for psychological evaluation. "Doctor, I need you to understand something. I'm a police officer who discovered criminal activity. I'm not mentally ill, and I don't belong in a psychiatric facility. I understand that you believe what you experienced was real," Dr. Phillips replied with professional gentleness. "But sometimes stress and overwork can cause our minds to interpret ordinary situations as threatening or conspiratorial. The goal of our evaluation is to determine whether your perceptions accurately reflect reality." Travis spent the rest of the day undergoing psychological tests, medical examinations, and interviews with various specialists. Each interaction followed the same pattern. Professional courtesy combined with the underlying assumption that he was psychologically unstable and unable to distinguish between reality and paranoid fantasies. That evening, as he sat in his private room overlooking the Houston skyline, Travis realized the full genius of the trap that had been constructed around him. Even if he somehow convinced the hospital staff that he was sane, even if he was released after 72 hours, his credibility as a police officer would be permanently destroyed. Any future attempt to expose the water contamination would be dismissed as the continued delusions of an officer who'd already been institutionalized for mental health issues. But what terrified Travis most was the realization that while he was locked away in Houston, the people of Ridgeville were still drinking contaminated water. Every day he spent in the psychiatric facility was another day that 8,000 people were being slowly poisoned for profit, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Travis lay on the narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to find some way to protect his community from the inside of a psychiatric facility. But every option he considered led back to the same conclusion. He'd been neutralized as effectively as if they'd simply made him disappear. The conspiracy was proceeding on schedule while he was locked away, discredited and helpless. Somewhere in Ridgeville, Mayor Shane and his associates were congratulating themselves on how efficiently they'd handled the Travis Coleman problem. The water contamination would continue, the environmental studies would be completed on schedule, and the natural gas extraction would begin as planned. All because one honest police officer had tried to protect his community and discovered that the real criminals were the people he'd trusted to lead it. On his second day in the facility, Travis was assigned to a group therapy session led by Dr. Phillips. The other participants were a mix of individuals dealing with various mental health issues, but one man caught Travis's attention immediately. The man introduced himself as Garrett Sullivan, a former sheriff's deputy from Newton County who'd been in the facility for 6 weeks. During a break in the session, Garrett approached Travis privately. "Been here 6 weeks," Garrett said quietly. "Started asking too many questions about missing persons cases in my jurisdiction. Next thing I know, I'm having a psychological evaluation for paranoid delusions." Travis felt a chill of recognition. What kind of missing persons cases? Rural folks mostly, people who lived alone, didn't have much family. Their cars would be found abandoned on back roads, but the people were never found. When I started connecting the cases, started thinking maybe they weren't random disappearances, my supervisor decided I was getting too stressed and needed professional help. Travis realized he wasn't the first police officer who'd been neutralized this way. There were probably others across East Texas, law enforcement officers who'd gotten too close to various criminal operations and had been discredited through forced psychiatric evaluation. "How many of us are there?" Travis asked. "In this facility? At least 3 that I know of. Maybe more who haven't identified themselves yet." That afternoon, Travis requested a private meeting with Dr. Phillips in her office. Officer Coleman, how are you feeling about your treatment so far? Doctor, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer. How many law enforcement officers have been patients here in the past year? Dr. Phillips's expression became guarded. I'm not sure I understand the relevance of that question to your treatment. Please, just answer the question. After a long pause, she replied, Several. We specialize in treating first responders who develop occupational stress disorders. How many is several? Officer Coleman, I think we should focus on your specific situation rather than... Doctor, I think you should know that Garrett Sullivan told me about missing persons cases in Newton County, and I'd be willing to bet that every law enforcement officer who's been treated here was investigating something that involved corruption, organized crime, or systematic cover-ups by people in positions of authority. Dr. Phillips's silence confirmed his suspicion. You know, don't you? Travis continued. You know that some of your patients aren't mentally ill. They're police officers and deputies and investigators who got too close to something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Officer Coleman, even if that were true, what would you expect me to do about it? I'm a psychiatrist, not a criminal investigator. You could document it. You could create a record that shows a pattern of law enforcement officers being institutionalized after investigating specific types of cases involving public corruption. Dr. Phillips stared out her office window for several minutes before responding. Officer Coleman, I became a psychiatrist to help people who are genuinely suffering from mental illness. But over the past 2 years, I've been seeing more and more patients who don't seem to fit the typical profiles for the conditions they've been diagnosed with. Patients like me and Garrett. Patients who tell consistent, detailed stories about criminal conspiracies that they claim to have witnessed. Patients who seem completely rational and competent except for their delusions about corruption and cover-ups involving people in positions of authority. Travis leaned forward. Doctor, what if they're not delusions? What if some of your patients are telling the truth? Then I'm being used as an instrument of oppression, Dr. Phillips said quietly. I'm being used to silence people who've discovered things that powerful interests want to keep hidden. Will you help us? Dr. Phillips was quiet for a long time, clearly wrestling with the ethical implications of what Travis was suggesting. Finally, she spoke. I can't help you escape, and I can't falsify your psychiatric evaluation. But I can document everything you and the other officers have told me. I can create a record that establishes the pattern you're describing. And then what? I don't know. But if something happens to you, if you disappear or have an accident after you're released, there will be a documented record of what you told me. A record that establishes your credibility and mental competence at the time you made these allegations. It wasn't much, but it was something. Travis spent the rest of his time at the facility documenting everything he could remember about the water contamination operation in Ridgeville, creating a detailed written record that Dr. Phillips promised to preserve in secure files. On his final day at the facility, Travis received an unexpected visitor. Officer Nicole Martinez had driven down from Ridgeville, claiming to be conducting a welfare check on behalf of the police department. They met in a visitor's room under the supervision of hospital staff, which meant their conversation had to be carefully coded. But Nicole was smart enough to pick up on his subtle references. Travis, everyone back home is concerned about your health, Nicole said, her voice carrying subtle emphasis on certain words. The water department has been working overtime to address some quality issues that came up recently. Travis understood immediately. The contamination operation was continuing, possibly accelerating while he was gone. Quality issues? He asked. Nothing serious, according to the city council, Nicole replied, but her expression suggested otherwise. Just some unusual chemical readings that the monitoring equipment picked up. They held an emergency meeting to discuss upgrading the treatment systems. Emergency meeting. That meant they were moving faster than originally planned, probably because they knew Travis would be returning soon and wanted to complete their timeline before he could cause any more problems. When did these quality issues first show up? Travis asked. About 4 months ago, according to the official records. But the levels have increased recently. The city council says the equipment might need recalibration. Nicole was telling him that the contamination had reached dangerous levels, possibly because they were rushing to complete their regulatory preparation before his release from the psychiatric facility. Before Travis could ask more questions, a hospital staff member announced that visiting time was over. Nicole stood to leave, but as she gathered her things, she slipped a small piece of paper into Travis's hand. After she left, Travis unfolded the paper in his room. Written in Nicole's careful handwriting was a phone number and the words, "Call when you get out. There are others who know." Travis was released from the psychiatric facility on Monday morning with a clean bill of mental health and a recommendation for ongoing stress management counseling. The official report concluded that he'd suffered from acute work-related stress that had caused him to misinterpret routine municipal operations as criminal activity, but that he was now stable and fit for duty with appropriate monitoring and support. Dr. Phillips met with him privately before his discharge, handing him a sealed envelope with his official psychiatric evaluation and a business card with her personal contact information. "Officer Coleman, if you feel threatened or if your situation becomes dangerous, call the number on the back of that card immediately. And remember what we discussed about documentation? Sometimes the truth needs to be preserved even when it can't immediately be acted upon." The drive back to Ridgeville took 3 hours, during which Travis reviewed everything that had happened and tried to prepare himself for what he would face when he returned to a community where powerful people wanted him silenced. He knew his real work was just beginning. As he crested the hill overlooking Ridgeville, Travis could see the water treatment facility in the distance. The same facility where 4 days earlier he'd discovered that his hometown had been built on lies, that the people he'd trusted to lead his community were willing to poison their neighbors for money. But he also knew that Nicole had allies, that there were others who knew about the conspiracy, and that his forced hospitalization might not have been as successful in silencing him as the conspirators had hoped. Travis pulled into the parking lot of the Ridgeville Police Department, knowing that his life as a small-town police officer was forever changed. He would never again have the luxury of believing that his community was fundamentally good, that his colleagues were trustworthy, that the system he'd sworn to serve was worth preserving in its current form. Chief Anderson greeted him with what appeared to be genuine relief. "Travis, welcome back. How are you feeling?" "Much better, Chief. The evaluation was helpful. I'm ready to get back to work." "Good to hear. We've got a lot of catching up to do. There have been some changes while you were away, and I want to make sure you're fully briefed on new procedures and priorities." Travis was certain there had been changes. The question was whether any of the people in Ridgeville would live long enough to see justice served, or whether the contamination would claim victims before he could find a way to stop it. That evening, Travis called the number Nicole had given him. A woman answered on the second ring. "Officer Coleman, I've been hoping to hear from you. My name is Jessica Romano. I'm an investigative journalist from Austin. Nicole told me what you discovered at the water treatment facility." "Ms. Romano, how much do you know about the situation in Ridgeville?" "More than you might expect. Your case fits a pattern I've been tracking across rural East Texas. Communities where local officials have been compromised by energy development interests, where police officers investigating corruption have been neutralized through forced psychiatric evaluation." Travis felt a mixture of hope and horror. Hope that someone with resources and connections was aware of the conspiracy. Horror at learning that what had happened to him was part of a larger pattern. How many cases like mine? 11 documented incidents over the past 3 years. Police officers, sheriff's deputies, even a few federal investigators who got too close to operations involving illegal resource extraction and environmental crimes. Travis realized he wasn't an isolated victim. He was part of a systematic program to eliminate law enforcement interference with industrial crime operations. "Ms. Romano, The people in Ridgeville are still drinking contaminated water. Every day that passes is another day they're being poisoned. I know. That's why I've been working with a federal environmental crimes task force to build a case. But we need evidence, Officer Coleman. We need documentation that will hold up in federal court. I have photographs on my phone, but I'm not sure they'll be enough. Actually, they might be more valuable than you think. Combined with water samples that independent laboratories have been analyzing and testimony from other officers who've been silenced like you were, we might have enough to trigger a federal investigation. Other officers? The deputy from Newton County you met at the facility, a sheriff from Jasper County, 3 Texas Rangers who were investigating rural crime patterns involving energy company corruption. They've all been institutionalized for psychological evaluation after getting too close to various operations. Travis understood the scope of what they were fighting. It wasn't just about Ridgeville or even East Texas. It was a systematic program to neutralize law enforcement oversight of illegal industrial operations across the region. What do you need from me? Your complete testimony, documented and verified. Dr. Phillips has agreed to provide her professional assessment of your mental competence, which will help establish your credibility. When we present this case to federal authorities, we need to demonstrate that you were a reliable witness who was systematically discredited to prevent you from exposing criminal activity. And then what? Then we expose everything. The water contamination, the systematic corruption of local officials, the forced institutionalization of police officers, the environmental crimes being committed across rural Texas. All of it. 3 days later, Travis received a call from Nicole asking him to meet her at a diner in the next county. When he arrived, he found her sitting in a corner booth with 2 other people, a middle-aged woman in a business suit and a younger man wearing jeans and a polo shirt. Travis, this is Jessica Romano, the journalist I mentioned. And this is Special Agent Marcus Tyler from the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. Tyler showed his federal credentials. Officer Coleman, we've been investigating environmental crimes involving energy companies across East Texas for the past 18 months. Your case provides crucial evidence for a federal prosecution we've been building. What kind of prosecution? Romano spread files across the table. Conspiracy to violate federal environmental laws, systematic corruption of public officials, criminal interference with regulatory oversight, and, in your case, specifically, conspiracy to contaminate public water supplies and criminal retaliation against a law enforcement officer. We've been documenting similar operations in 12 counties, Tyler added. Energy companies working with local officials to circumvent environmental regulations using systematic contamination to hide industrial pollution and neutralizing any law enforcement officers who discover their operations. Travis stared at the files, which contained photographs, documents, and what appeared to be extensive evidence of criminal activity across multiple jurisdictions. How long have you known about this? We've suspected for over a year, Tyler replied, but proving it required finding law enforcement officers who'd witnessed the operations firsthand and were willing to testify. Officers like you who discovered the crimes and were systematically discredited to prevent them from reporting what they'd seen. Will this stop the contamination in Ridgeville? We're obtaining federal warrants to shut down all related operations immediately, Tyler said. Emergency injunctions to halt any contamination activities, followed by comprehensive environmental remediation and criminal prosecutions of everyone involved. Romano leaned forward. Officer Coleman, you need to understand that what you discovered in Ridgeville is part of a much larger criminal enterprise. When this case breaks, it's going to expose corruption at levels most people never imagined possible. The federal operation began at dawn on a Thursday morning. Travis watched from his patrol car as EPA investigators, FBI agents, and federal prosecutors descended on Ridgeville like an occupying army. The water treatment facility was seized and shut down immediately. Mayor Shane, Brandon Mitchell, Kyle Walsh, Derek Sterling, and 8 other local officials were arrested on federal charges. Dr. Sarah Martinez was taken into custody at the county health laboratory, along with evidence that she'd been falsifying water quality reports for over a year. The psychiatric facility in Houston was raided, and Dr. Phillips provided testimony about the systematic abuse of psychiatric evaluation to silence law enforcement officers. But for Travis, the most satisfying moment came when Chief Anderson was arrested at the police station, charged with conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation and criminal retaliation against a subordinate officer. "I trusted you," Travis said as federal agents led Anderson away in handcuffs. "I was trying to protect the department," Anderson replied. "You have no idea how much money was involved, how many important people had invested in this project." "I was trying to protect the people you swore to serve." The investigation that followed revealed the scope of what had been hidden beneath Ridgeville's surface. The natural gas extraction project had been financed by a consortium of energy companies worth billions of dollars. The systematic contamination of municipal water supplies was being used in dozens of communities across the South to circumvent environmental regulations. The psychiatric facility in Houston had been used to silence over 30 law enforcement officers who'd discovered various aspects of the criminal enterprise. Some had been released after treatment, but others had disappeared entirely into what federal investigators described as a network of illegal detention facilities. Travis testified before federal grand juries in 3 states, providing evidence that led to indictments of over 60 individuals, including energy company executives, government officials, and medical professionals who'd participated in the conspiracy. The people of Ridgeville learned that they'd been drinking contaminated water for months, that their elected officials had sold their health and safety for profit, that their trusted institutions had been systematically corrupted by people who saw them as obstacles to wealth rather than human beings deserving protection. The town's water supply was extensively treated and monitored for 2 years before federal authorities declared it safe. The psychological impact on the community was harder to measure, but Travis could see it in the faces of his neighbors. The loss of trust, the realization that the people they'd counted on to protect them had been the ones harming them. Travis remained with the Ridgeville Police Department, eventually becoming chief when the position opened after Anderson's conviction. But he never forgot the lesson he'd learned about the weight of trust and the price of speaking truth to power. Years later, when young officers would ask him about the case that had made his reputation, Travis would tell them that being a police officer meant sometimes choosing between career survival and community protection, that the people who seemed most trustworthy could be the most dangerous, that corruption worked by making good people complicit in evil through small compromises and reasonable-sounding justifications. But most importantly, he would tell them that a police officer's oath wasn't to superiors or politicians or powerful interests. It was to the people who trusted them to stand between danger and innocence, even when the danger came from those in authority. The weight of that trust, Travis learned, was the heaviest burden an honest officer could carry. And sometimes it was the only thing that made the job worth doing. The town of Ridgeville still exists, though it's changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The water tastes different now, not because of contamination, but because the residents know what it cost to make it safe. Trust, once broken, never quite heals the same way. Travis Coleman serves as chief of police, a position he never wanted but accepted because someone needed to rebuild what had been destroyed. On quiet nights, when he drives the same roads he patrolled as a young officer, he sometimes thinks about how close they came to losing everything. And he reminds himself that the next threat to his community might not come from strangers or obvious criminals. It might come from people he knows, people he trusts, people who have reasonable explanations for unreasonable actions. The weight of trust, Travis learned, never gets lighter. It only gets more precious as you understand how easily it can be broken, and how hard it is to rebuild once it's gone. The call came in at 4:23 a.m. on a muggy August morning that already promised to be another scorcher in Brazos County, Texas. Officer Blake Murphy had been working cattle theft cases for the past 6 months, a specialty assignment that had him covering the vast ranch lands of rural Texas where million-dollar herds grazed on spreads that could stretch for hundreds of square miles. Unit 47, we've got a report of suspicious vehicle activity at the Garrett Ranch on County Road 85. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. Ranch foreman reports seeing headlights and hearing truck engines near the northwest pasture around 2 a.m. Blake acknowledged the call and began the 40-minute drive to the Garrett property, one of the largest cattle operations in the county with over 12,000 head of prime Angus beef scattered across nearly 50,000 acres. The ranch had been in the Garrett family for 4 generations, and Austin Garrett, the current owner, had built it into one of the most successful cattle operations in Texas. As Blake drove through the pre-dawn darkness, his headlights cutting through the humid air that clung to the asphalt like syrup, he reflected on how cattle theft had evolved over the years he'd been working these cases. What used to be desperate cowboys rustling a few head for quick money had become sophisticated criminal operations involving semi-trucks, mobile processing equipment, and organized rings that could steal, butcher, and sell hundreds of cattle before the theft was even discovered. The modern cattle thief was more likely to be a businessman with connections to processing plants and distribution networks than a desperate rancher trying to make ends meet. The profit margins were enormous. A single trailer load of stolen cattle could be worth over $100,000, and with proper documentation and processing, the meat could be laundered through legitimate food distribution channels within days. Blake had worked 23 cattle theft cases in the past year, recovering over $3 million worth of stolen livestock. But he'd also noticed patterns that suggested the random theft incidents he was investigating might be connected to larger criminal operations. Too many of the crimes showed similar methods, timing, and target selection to be coincidental. The thieves knew ranch schedules, security patterns, and had access to transportation and processing capabilities that went far beyond what individual criminals could organize. The Garrett Ranch entrance was marked by an impressive stone archway bearing the family name in wrought iron letters. Blake showed his identification to the security guard at the gate, itself an indication of how serious ranch security had become in recent years, and received directions to the ranch house where Austin Garrett was waiting for him. Garrett turned out to be a man in his early 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He was dressed in working clothes despite the early hour, suggesting he'd been up all night dealing with whatever had happened on his property. His expression was grim as he approached Blake's patrol car. "Officer Murphy, thanks for coming out so quickly. I've got dead cattle in my northwest pasture, and the circumstances are unusual." Blake followed Garrett's pickup truck across 15 miles of ranch roads to reach the affected area. As they drove, Garrett explained over the radio what his overnight security patrol had discovered. Around 2 a.m., our patrol noticed lights in a section of pasture where there shouldn't have been any activity. By the time they got there, whoever it was had gone. But they left behind one hell of a mess. The crime scene that awaited Blake was unlike anything he'd encountered in his cattle theft investigations. In a cleared area of about 2 acres, surrounded by temporary fencing that hadn't been there the day before, lay the carcasses of 43 cattle. But these animals hadn't been rustled in any traditional sense. They'd been systematically slaughtered and partially processed on site using professional equipment. Blake stepped out of his patrol car into the oppressive heat and immediately noticed the smell. Not just death, but the industrial odors of a slaughterhouse operation. Professional-grade portable equipment had been set up in the cleared area: hydraulic lifts, butchering stations, refrigeration units, and what appeared to be a complete mobile meat processing facility. The cattle had been killed with captive bolt guns, the same method used in legitimate slaughterhouses, then hung and partially processed according to commercial butchering standards. Every cut had been made with precision, every piece of meat removed with the efficiency that came from years of professional experience. "This isn't random theft," Blake said as he surveyed the scene, making notes in his patrol book while trying to process what he was seeing. "This is organized, professional, and temporary. They brought in sophisticated equipment, set up a complete processing operation, did their work efficiently, and cleaned up afterward." What made the scene even more disturbing was its surgical efficiency. Every piece of meat that could be easily transported had been removed with professional precision. What remained were the portions that would be difficult to move quickly: bones, organs, and cuts that required special handling or extended refrigeration. The criminals had taken only the most valuable and portable parts, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of usable meat because it didn't fit their transportation and distribution requirements. "Mr. Garrett, when did you last check this section of your property?" 3 days ago during our regular patrol. Everything was normal then. No sign of any preparation, no equipment, no indication that anyone had been scouting the area." "And your cattle were all healthy, showing no signs of disease or injury?" "Prime breeding stock. Some of the best animals on the ranch, worth about $3,000 per head. Someone knew exactly which cattle to take and had the expertise to identify and select the most valuable animals from a herd of over 12,000. Blake began documenting the scene with his camera, but what struck him most was the level of organization required for what he was witnessing. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned operation that required advanced scouting, specialized equipment, transportation logistics, and personnel with professional butchering skills. As he worked, Blake's radio crackled with an update from dispatch that made his blood run cold. "Unit 47, we're receiving reports of similar incidents at 3 other ranches in your area. The Morrison spread, the Jenkins property, and the Walsh ranch all report evidence of overnight cattle processing operations." Blake felt his stomach drop as he understood the implications. 4 ranches hit simultaneously with identical methods suggested a coordinated operation involving multiple teams, extensive resources, and sophisticated planning. This wasn't cattle rustling, it was industrial-scale meat theft conducted with military precision. "Dispatch, I'm going to need forensic support, additional units, and supervisory response. We're looking at what appears to be organized criminal activity on a scale we haven't seen before." While waiting for backup, Blake interviewed Austin Garrett about ranch security, recent visitors, and any unusual activity in the area. What he learned painted a picture of criminals who had done extensive reconnaissance before carrying out their operation. "Someone knew our patrol schedule," Garrett explained, consulting a clipboard with security logs. "They hit the northwest pasture during the longest gap between security rounds, from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. They knew which cattle were the most valuable and exactly where they were grazing, and they had detailed knowledge of our property layout, including access roads that don't appear on any public maps." "Inside information?" "Has to be. No way outsiders could have known that much about our operations without help from someone who works here or has worked here recently. Someone with access to our security protocols, our cattle inventory systems, our property maps." Blake made careful notes about current and former employees, delivery services, veterinarians, feed suppliers, and anyone else who might have had access to detailed information about the ranch's operations and security procedures. By the time forensic specialists and additional officers arrived, Blake had identified several disturbing aspects of the crime that went beyond simple theft. The portable processing equipment was professional grade and expensive, the kind of machinery used by legitimate meat processing operations, not makeshift criminal enterprises. Someone had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment that could be transported, set up, and operated in remote locations. The temporary fencing that had been erected around the crime scene was high-quality livestock fencing, properly installed with professional tools and techniques. Someone had spent considerable time and money creating a secure perimeter for their illegal operation, suggesting this wasn't their first such crime. Most concerning was evidence that the criminals had been monitoring radio communications. Blake found electronic equipment near the crime scene that appeared to be designed for intercepting and monitoring law enforcement and ranch security radio frequencies. "They were listening to our communications," Blake told Sergeant Kyle Davidson when he arrived to oversee the multi-ranch investigation. "They knew when patrols were in the area, when shifts changed, when backup was being called. This was a military-style operation with sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities." Sergeant Davidson had been with the Texas Department of Public Safety for 18 years and had never seen cattle theft on this scale or with this level of organization. "Blake, what you're describing sounds more like organized crime than agricultural theft. The resources, planning, and coordination required for simultaneous hits on 4 ranches suggests we're dealing with criminal enterprises that go far beyond local rustling operations." As they discussed the scope of the investigation, Blake's radio crackled with another update that made the situation even more serious. "All units were receiving reports of cattle theft incidents at 6 additional ranches in Brazos and surrounding counties. Pattern appears identical to previous incidents: professional processing operations, high-value cattle, sophisticated equipment. 10 ranches hit in a single night. Blake estimated that the criminals had stolen and processed over 500 cattle worth more than $2 million. The scale and coordination required suggested an organization with resources that rivaled legitimate agricultural businesses. "Sergeant Davidson, I think we need to consider the possibility that this isn't just theft. Someone is building a shadow cattle industry, complete with processing, transportation, and distribution capabilities. They're essentially running a parallel meat production operation using stolen livestock." Davidson nodded grimly. "Which means they have buyers, processing facilities, distribution networks, and probably legitimate business fronts to launder the stolen meat. This could be organized crime moving into agricultural theft on an industrial scale." As Blake continued documenting evidence at the Garrett Ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that what they'd discovered was just the tip of a much larger criminal enterprise. The professional execution, the sophisticated equipment, the intelligence gathering capabilities, and the multi-location coordination all suggested an organization with significant resources and long-term planning capabilities. But what worried Blake most was something Austin Garrett had mentioned during his interview. Several other ranch owners in the area had reported losing small numbers of cattle over the past few months, losses that had been attributed to normal mortality, predation, or simple miscounting. What if those earlier losses had been reconnaissance missions, a way for the criminals to test security systems and gather intelligence for the massive operation they'd carried out last night? "Mr. Garrett, I need you to contact every rancher you know and ask them to conduct a complete cattle count going back 6 months. Any unexplained losses, any cattle that went missing and were assumed dead or wandered off. I suspect last night's operation was the culmination of months of planning and preparation." As Blake prepared to move to the second crime scene, he realized he was no longer investigating simple cattle theft. He was potentially dealing with an organized criminal conspiracy that had systematically infiltrated and exploited the Texas cattle industry. The criminals weren't just stealing cattle. They were building a shadow agricultural empire that could eventually threaten the entire legitimate beef industry. And if they were sophisticated enough to carry out simultaneous operations across multiple counties, coordinate complex logistics, and intercept law enforcement communications, they were sophisticated enough to eliminate anyone who got too close to their operation. The radio crackled again with another update that confirmed Blake's worst fears. "Unit 47, we've got reports of suspicious activity at cattle processing facilities in 4 counties. Facilities operating outside normal hours with no scheduled deliveries. Pattern suggests possible connection to overnight ranch incidents." Blake felt his stomach drop as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. The criminals hadn't just stolen cattle. They'd coordinated the theft with illegal processing operations that could turn the stolen livestock into untraceable meat products within hours. This wasn't just organized crime. This was a conspiracy that reached into the heart of Texas agriculture, involving people with access to legitimate processing facilities, distribution networks, and possibly regulatory oversight. Over the next 72 hours, Blake found himself at the center of the largest agricultural crime investigation in Texas history. The evidence they gathered painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for at least 2 years, systematically infiltrating rural communities and corrupting legitimate businesses to support their illegal operations. The investigation revealed that the criminal organization had recruited current and former employees from dozens of ranches, processing plants, and transportation companies. They had inside information about security procedures, cattle inventories, market prices, and shipping schedules. Most disturbing, they had corrupted officials in agricultural inspection agencies who provided them with legitimate documentation for stolen cattle. Blake's investigation led to the arrest of 47 individuals across 6 states, including ranch foremen, processing plant supervisors, trucking company owners, and government inspectors. The criminal organization had stolen an estimated $15 million worth of cattle over 2 years and had laundered the meat through legitimate distribution channels that supplied restaurants and grocery stores across the Southeast. But the case took a personal turn for Blake when the investigation revealed that someone had been tracking his movements and monitoring his communications throughout the investigation. The criminals had identified him as the primary threat to their operation and had begun planning to eliminate him before he could gather enough evidence for prosecution. The threat became real when Blake's patrol car was sabotaged while he was interviewing witnesses at a ranch outside Huntsville. Only luck and his military training in vehicle maintenance had prevented what would have appeared to be a tragic accident on a remote country road. "They're not just stealing cattle," Blake told Sergeant Davidson as they reviewed intelligence gathered from wiretaps and surveillance operations. "They're protecting a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise, and they're willing to kill law enforcement officers to keep it operating." The final confrontation came when Blake went undercover as a corrupt ranch foreman willing to provide inside information to the criminal organization. The plan was to gather evidence of their leadership structure and operational methods, but Blake found himself face to face with people who had no intention of letting him walk away alive. The undercover operation led Blake to a remote processing facility in East Texas, where he witnessed the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Dozens of stolen cattle being processed by a crew of professional butchers, sophisticated refrigeration and packaging equipment, and trucks being loaded with meat destined for legitimate grocery chains. But Blake also discovered that he'd walked into a trap. The criminals had identified him as an undercover officer and had planned to eliminate him along with 2 other law enforcement officers who'd infiltrated their organization. The confrontation that followed involved gunfire, high-speed chases through rural Texas, and a final showdown at the processing facility where Blake found himself outnumbered and outgunned by criminals who had nothing left to lose. Blake survived, but barely. The case ended with multiple arrests, the seizure of millions of dollars in stolen property, and the dismantling of a criminal organization that had corrupted dozens of legitimate businesses. But it also left Blake with the understanding that rural Texas was being systematically exploited by criminal enterprises with resources and sophistication that rivaled legitimate corporations. The cattle theft case had started with reports of suspicious activity at a single ranch. It ended with the realization that organized crime had moved into agricultural theft on a scale that threatened the integrity of America's food supply. For Blake Murphy, it was a reminder that in modern law enforcement, even the most traditional crimes, cattle rustling in rural Texas, could evolve into something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The criminals weren't just stealing livestock anymore. They were stealing the trust that held rural communities together, and they were willing to kill to protect their profits. The case made Blake's reputation as an investigator, but it also left him with a profound understanding of how vulnerable rural communities were to criminal exploitation. The vast distances, the limited law enforcement resources, the trust-based relationships that had sustained agricultural communities for generations. All of it could be weaponized by criminals who understood how to exploit the very values that made rural Texas strong. Years later, when Blake had risen to become a specialist in agricultural crimes, he would tell other officers that the cattle theft case had taught him that no crime was too traditional or too simple to become the foundation for something much more dangerous, that criminals evolved faster than law enforcement's understanding of their methods, and that protecting rural communities required constant vigilance against threats that could emerge from the most familiar and trusted aspects of agricultural life. The blood and barbed wire of rural Texas had always marked boundaries between right and wrong, between order and chaos. Blake Murphy learned that those boundaries were under constant attack by people who saw them not as protection, but as obstacles to profit. And sometimes, defending those boundaries required a police officer to risk everything, career, safety, life itself, to preserve the trust that made communities worth protecting. In the end, that's what separated the good officers from the merely competent ones, the willingness to pay the price that protecting others required, even when that price included everything they had.